Duke Colin of Leveton, who held all the power and wealth of the kingdom, was the protagonist of the Leveton family story. The girl looked at the man before her, wondering how her reincarnated self had become a poor background character. In the novel, Colin asked the little girl if she would be his adopted daughter, but she was terrified, clutching her skirt tightly, feeling that this stroke of good fortune was like a nightmare and that something bad was about to happen. The Duke stared at the girl, surprised that she didn't respond to his offer. The man narrowed his eyes, trying to figure out what was wrong with the girl before him. The little girl looked at him in fear, but all she could think about was that she knew the story of this novel, and in it, the Duke was a cold-blooded killer. A short while ago, before meeting the Duke, the little girl was sitting and looking at a newspaper, trying to decipher an advertisement for a maid. Walter sat beside the girl, surprised that she was looking at a newspaper when she could barely recognize the words. The girl threw the newspaper on the ground and yelled at her friend that she knew a few words. The children were sitting on the ground against a wall, and the little girl shared her thoughts with her friend. She didn't want to be poor her whole life, and to change her fate, she needed to find a job and a place to live. The girl continued to search for a job in the newspaper, while Walter mused aloud about fate and whether it could be changed. But his friend told him to stop bothering her, as changing one's fate was difficult and she needed to concentrate. The girl recalled how, after her mother's death, she was left alone on the streets and had to beg from strangers in the market square. A young couple gave her a loaf of bread, and her friends all said that people helped her because she was just so adorable. The girl didn't hesitate to take food from the rich, as she and her friends had a division of labor. Some children were responsible for spotting wealthy people, and then she would go up and use her charm. After a successful haul, the children would happily divide the food and eat the bread together. The boy called the girl's name and tapped her on the shoulder. Lee was startled out of her memories and complained for him to leave her alone. Walter pointed to a tall man in the crowd, guessing that he looked very rich. Lee scanned the crowd, her gaze falling on a man in a red hat who was in a hurry. Her friend then pointed to another man wearing a black cloak. Lee leaped to her feet, her mood brightening, and told the boy to leave the rest to her. She didn't know that this encounter would change her life. The little girl quietly approached the man, gently tugged on his cloak, and begged him for a coin. The man turned around at the sound of her voice, exuding an air of nobility. Lee immediately saw that he was incredibly handsome. The next moment, the man casually pushed the girl aside, ordering her to get out of the way because he was busy. After being pushed like that, Lee stumbled, and strange memories suddenly flooded her mind. A memory surfaced in the girl's mind, showing a doctor talking to two adults. The memory shifted, and now a girl was in a hospital room observing the conversation. The memories kept changing, and now Lee saw the girl in the hospital room reading a book about the daily life of the Leveton family, and she realized that was herself in a past life. Suddenly, a scene from the novel flashed through her mind. Duke Leveton was moving through a crowd, searching for a criminal and worrying that he might escape by train. The scene then switched to a man in a red hat, who was actually the criminal, but the Duke did not yet suspect him. Lee sank deeper into her memories, now recalling another chapter of the novel, where the criminal hid his face with his hat and disappeared into a crowd of beggars. Scattered fragments from the novel continued to play out, and now Colin was rushing towards the train station. But just as the Duke was rushing to the station, a ruffian was causing trouble among the poor, and a child named Walter was caught up in the brawl. Suddenly, all the strange memories vanished, and Lee was back in reality, standing in the middle of the market. Lee overheard the Duke cursing that he couldn't find the culprit, and she became frightened, worrying that the events from the book she had seen were about to happen, which meant Walter was in danger. The girl ran back to Colin and grabbed his black cloak. Lee screamed in terror with all her might, telling the man not to go to the station or many people would get hurt. The little girl, still clutching the man's cloak, desperately explained that there was a strange man in a red hat in the square who pretended to go to the station, but then disappeared into an alley. When the girl told him the stranger looked like the wanted demon killer, William, from the posters, Colin looked at her suspiciously. Lee began to shout in a panic, agreeing with every question the man asked, hoping he would hurry to the alley. The Duke turned and rushed from the city's main street into an alley. Suddenly, a loud scream was heard from the alley. Many people in the crowd looked towards the corner in surprise, wondering what was happening. Lee ran to the corner of the building and carefully peeked into the alley, making sure she wasn't spotted. In the alley, the girls saw the Duke using black magic, surrounding the criminal from all sides. With a flick of his wrist, Colin changed the direction of the magic, slamming the wanted man hard onto the ground. The man walked up to the villain pinned him to the ground with his foot, and then whispered that it was truly satisfying. Colin's eyes burned with rage as he stared at his defeated enemy, brandishing his cane and admitting that he took pleasure in getting rid of such scum. The sounds of fighting and screams filled the alley, and Lee covered her ears in terror. When everything fell silent, the girl peeked through her fingers, still thinking that the man in the cloak might have gone completely mad. Colin stood in the alley, his expression relaxing after catching the murderer, and casually flicked his hair back. However, the thick drops of blood dripping from his cane were proof that the killer could no longer harm anyone. The girl was terrified by the scene before her. Her legs grew weak as she stumbled backward, desperately thinking of how to escape. The girl spun around and ran as fast as she could toward the crowded street. Suddenly, a strong hand grabbed her by the collar and yanked her aside before she could even scream. Colin pinned the child against the wall, looking her up and down while she choked and gasped for air. After his rough grab, the man had to take her by the shoulders and shake her gently to calm her down enough to answer his questions. Lee trembled like a leaf in fear, and all she could do was beg him to let her go. Just as Colin crouched down, the shouts of police were heard from the street, ordering everyone to check the alley. The man quickly pressed a gold card into the girl's hand, implying there were too many prying eyes around. It wasn't convenient to speak freely. The Duke leaped into the air, smoke swirling around him, introduced himself as Colin Leveton, and told the girl to come find him. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, and by the time she came to her senses, the police had surrounded her, but she didn't even notice, too busy staring at the card in her hand. After a terrible day, Lee fell asleep on the pavement, covering herself with newspapers and a ragged blanket. Even in her sleep, she was troubled by the fact that she was trapped in some novel's world, reincarnated as a nameless nobody living in the gutter. Lee slept restlessly, afraid that she would die in poverty, never able to enjoy all that this new world had to offer. Lee began to dream of her parents from her past life embracing her, praying that she would be born healthy and happy in her next life. It seemed she only got the healthy part. Morning came, and after a very uncomfortable night on the ground, Lee reluctantly woke up and stretched her arms. The girl looked around and was surprised to find her newspaper strewn with red flower petals. Lee was examining the flowers, but then her gaze locked onto the letters on the newspaper. She squinted, trying to figure out where she had seen them before. Suddenly, she took out the golden business card and began comparing the text on it with the newspaper. It dawned on her that the font was exactly the same. The girl was thrilled by her hunch, and she began to flip through the newspaper, searching for a specific advertisement. When Lee read in the newspaper that Duke Leveton's household was hiring a maid, she clenched her fists in excitement. This was her chance, a real opportunity to change her fate. An incredibly bored-looking guard repeatedly confirmed whether Lee had really received the card directly from the Duke himself. Lee was determined to see her plan through, so she confidently declared that the Duke had given her the card and told her to come see him. The guard wasn't convinced and kept squinting at the card, making Lee worry that he thought she was lying. Just then, a carriage appeared at the main gate. The courtyard was silent, followed by the screeching sound of the carriage as it approached the gate. The carriage stopped, and a black-haired man stepped out, and Lee began to size him up. Surprisingly, the man looked a lot like Duke Colin, with the same ruby-like eyes and arrogant posture. But as he walked to the gate, he asked, "What in the world is going on here?" Lee was still looking the stranger up and down as the guard told him that the girl claimed to be there to see the Duke. At his request, the man turned his attention to the girl, surprised that his father had new interest. But as he was sizing Lee up, she recognized him as the Duke's son, Jade. The girl gathered her courage again and declared that she needed to see the Duke about something important. Unsurprised, Jade opened the gate and calmly walked into the courtyard, letting the girl follow him. A few minutes later, Jade and Lee were in the mansion's hallway, and Lord Colin, who was standing at the living room door, noticed them, looking somewhat surprised by their arrival. The Duke carefully sized up the guest who had come to his mansion. Jade walked into the room, but Lee stood timidly at the door, a worried look in her eyes. Jade stood by his father and asked if he really knew the girl, as she had a gilded car that could have been stolen. But his father admitted that he knew the girl and owed her a favor. The son glanced curiously at the guest, wondering if his father had really invited her to their home. Lee finally steadied her nerves and gathered the courage to ask if the house was hiring a maid. When the Duke asked why she was interested, the girl got scared, so Lee admitted she had seen the job in a newspaper ad. Lee's voice trembled as she nervously wrung her hands and said that since she had helped the Duke, perhaps the Duke could help her. Colin, sitting calmly in his armchair, asked out of simple curiosity how old the girl was, to which Lee humbly replied, 9 years old. Suddenly afraid she was too young, Lee rushed to explain to the Duke that she was very strong and healthy for her age, so she could eat 1 meal a day and do any job. The girl looked at her hands and declared she could scrub the floors until they shone, using different rags and soapy water. But feeling that wasn't enough, Lee suddenly declared that, because she was small, she could fit into the pipes to clean the chimneys. The girl's speech was interrupted by footsteps, and a young lady appeared in the living room, amazed by the little one's abilities, and introduced herself as Maryanne. Lee was struck by how much more beautiful Colin's sister was than in the novel. Maryanne knelt beside the girl and kindly asked about her parents and where she lived. Lee answered honestly that she had lost her mother a few years ago and had no home. Jade had been listening to the girl's story, so he couldn't help but ask where she slept if she had no home. Afraid she would be thrown out, Lee rushed to say that she didn't carry any diseases, as the alley where she slept was clean, and at night, she just covered herself with a discarded blanket. An awkward silence fell over everyone after the girl finished her story. After hearing the story, Maryanne became interested in why the girl wanted to be a servant, since she could have asked for more in return for helping the Duke. Lee walked up to the girl sitting in the armchair and confessed that with this job, she would be different, and when she grew up, she would no longer live in poverty. Suddenly, Lee's mood dropped, and she hesitantly clutched the hem of her dirty dress, whispering that she dreamed of changing her fate and living a normal life so that no one would ever look down on or bully her again. Maryanne knelt beside the girl and gently stroked her head. The lady praised Lee for her fighting spirit, while the little one confessed she didn't know who else to turn to. The lady was sizing up the girl. That's when her gaze fell on a small red petal in a lock of Lee's hair. Lee took out a few flowers and offered them to Maryanne as a gift, but the Duke suddenly tensed up. Colin's eyes were fixed on the girl. He tried to keep his voice steady as he pressed her about where she got the flowers. The girl handed the flowers to the man's outstretched hand, and fearing she'd be taken for a thief, she rushed to explain that she had woken up to find the flowers beside her. Lee remembered a boy who sold flowers on the street and donated the leftovers to orphans, guessing that her friends might have left them for her. Maryanne, not too interested in the story of the flowers, decided to ask how much the girl wanted for the job, and the little one quickly assured her she would take whatever they gave her or a quarter of an adult's salary. Duke Colin began to examine the flower, but his gaze was wary, and he wasn't really listening to their conversation. Lee, worried that the lady wasn't responding to her offer, decided to name an even lower price for the job. Suddenly, the Duke turned to the girl and demanded the truth about how she knew he was chasing a killer on the street. Lee was confident, having prepared her lie beforehand, so she repeated without hesitation that she had seen the criminal on a poster for a dangerous wanted man. Colin thoughtfully twirled the flower in his hand, still not believing her answer, and pressed her on why she had singled him out of the entire crowd. Lee stood before him flustered, not understanding why he was interrogating her, and blurted out some lame excuse that it was a complete coincidence. The Duke was skeptical of her claim, but then Lee turned on the charm, flashing a sweet smile and explaining with childlike innocence that he had caught her eye on the street because he was so handsome, and she never would have guessed he was a high-ranking nobleman. Colin fell for the girl's trick and didn't press further, only asking how she knew about his plan to go to the train station. Lee stuck to her story, assuring him that he was well-dressed, and people like him usually had no reason to be running around in dirty alleys. The girl's imagination worked at full speed as she quickly concocted a story that the fastest way to the train station was through the alley. The Duke smirked, impressed by the little girl's quick wit. Lee fell silent, secretly hoping she had successfully thrown him off her trail. Colin stood up from his chair, pointed to the door, and told her to wait outside while he held a family meeting. The moment the children slipped into the hallway, all the strength seemed to drain from her body, and she collapsed onto a bench with a sigh, hoping she hadn't messed things up with the Duke. The wait was agonizing, so Lee clasped her hands and prayed silently, hoping they would accept her and let her do any dirty work they trusted her with. In the living room, Maryanne calmly weighed the girl's fate and suggested taking her in. Jade was stressed by the whole situation, but he advised his aunt not to treat the child like a pet. The woman took her nephew's words to heart and countered that in her temple, the girl could eat well and receive an education. Colin was completely focused on the flower, but he joined the family conversation as he didn't want the girl to end up as a nun. The family was surprised by Colin's statement, and Maryanne began to worry about the rumors that would spread about their family if such a young servant appeared in their house. The Duke couldn't help but suggest adopting the girl and raising her as a member of the family, but Jade disapproved of his father's joke. Suddenly, Colin crushed the red flower in his hand with all his might, and it crumbled into petals. The Duke dusted the remnants of the plant from his glove and then announced with a sly smile that he wasn't joking. Lee was invited into the living room, and now she sensed the situation was even more tense than before. Colin dropped a bombshell, saying that the maid positions were already filled, and you could see the sheer despair on Lee's face. The girl hung her head as dark thoughts swirled in her mind, and she began to blame herself for getting her hopes up. The Duke, unmoved by her sadness, simply said that if she was willing to do whatever they told her, she would receive 5 gold coins a week. The payment stunned Lee, and she immediately began to imagine how much bread she could buy. But the joy quickly faded and was replaced by worry, as Lee realized she couldn't possibly get that much money for nothing. Her mind raced, and she suddenly imagined the Duke had a hobby of taxidermy, and she would soon be lined up with the rest of his collection. Colin, seeing the girl's confusion, calmly stated that their family had never had a daughter and proposed that the child become their adopted daughter. Lee's eyes lit up, thinking it was just some kind of servant role in the house, and that no one was actually going to adopt her. Maryanne laughed until tears streamed down her face and assured Lee that she would no longer be a servant, but the one being served. The girl felt dizzy with the sudden realization that she was really going to become the family's daughter. Maryanne leaned closer to her brother, complaining that he didn't know how to talk about things properly and that now the child thought it would be her job. A dull knock sounded on the door, and then it creaked open as the butler appeared with the news that the prince was waiting to meet with the Duke. Colin's reaction was cold, demanding not to be disturbed while he was talking with his family. Lee was startled by the master's icy tone, realizing that the Leveton family might be more powerful than the royal family. Suddenly, the Duke stroked the girl's hair and promised that she wouldn't have to work at such a young age. The girl looked at him expectantly, but the man added to his promise, assuring her that she wouldn't have to live on the streets and could live in his house. Hearing the Duke ask her again to be his daughter, Lee was stunned by the incredible request and clutched the hem of her skirt tightly. The girl imagined herself gaining the status of the most noble lady in the country, and her life would shine with brilliant colors. But her fantasy was overshadowed by the thought that the Leveton family had many dark secrets she would be drawn into. Lee buried her face in her hair and shook her head. She didn't know how much joy or pain this opportunity would bring, but it was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. Colin waited patiently for her answer. Lee's heart pounded in her chest, but she gathered her courage and said she accepted his offer. The Duke stood up from his chair, relieved that everything was settled. He went to inform the butler of the situation himself. The man set off to meet the prince, but Maryanne was furious that he hadn't even bothered to ask the girl's name. The Duke simply said he would give her one himself. His coldness stung her, and with a mix of nervousness and defiance, she declared that her name was Lee, given to her by her mother. The sudden words made the Duke stop in his tracks. The man guessed that with a name like that, she must have been born on a Monday, and his assumption stunned the little girl. Lee was full of questions, but the man was already focused on something else. He just looked at her and said he knew an ancient language in which her name meant Monday. A short while later, a bath was prepared for Lee in one of the estate's rooms. The little girl carefully tested the water temperature with her toe. Lee peeked out from behind the curtain to survey the bathroom, which was larger than the living room and filled with all sorts of fixtures. The girl hid behind the curtain again when the butler appeared and said the maids would be there shortly to help her, but Lee begged him not to leave. The butler introduced himself as Cheyenne and promised to answer all of Lee's questions after her bath. The little one peeked carefully through the curtain, still asking what it meant to be an adopted daughter. Cheyenne promised that he would take care of her now, as she was one of the mistresses of the house. But that didn't satisfy Lee, and the butler decided they needed to have a serious talk. The butler decided to educate Lee on the world of the rich and how noble families sometimes, though rarely, adopt children. But usually, nobles take this step so that their only child is not always alone. Noble families sometimes see this as an act of charity, providing an orphan with a good education and upbringing. Some nobles train these children to become masters of a particular skill. But in the end, if a young lady appears in the family, everyone will start praising the Duke and his family's benevolence. Lee listened intently to Cheyenne's story, a plan already forming in her mind to repay the Duke if she could become a praiseworthy girl. Suddenly, Lee's fantasy shifted to a dark figure, and a voice in her head said that a little girl's chances of survival were slim in a world of streets overrun with predators. The girl hugged her knees and continued to soak in the tub, thinking that it was fine to be treated as an object of charity by the Leveton family, since she wouldn't starve and could receive an education. Cheyenne, realizing his words about charity might have been harsh, bowed and promised to take better care of Lou. The butler tried to ease the tension, admitting the Duke was a reclusive person who didn't much care for socializing, though Lee already knew Cullen had a dark past. Cheyenne quietly slipped out through the slightly ajar door, confessing as he left that the most important thing now was for Lou to grow up safe and healthy. The door slammed shut, and Lou tried to relax in the tub, but her thoughts were a mess. She knew she was now the daughter of a murderer and had no idea how she was supposed to live a peaceful and healthy life. Lee tried to recall memories from her previous life. In the novel, Cullen wasn't just a killer, but the strongest mage of the past 500 years. The story in the novel was that Cullen was cursed to kill, after which he had to sustain himself by absorbing dark energy, but this led to mana absorption syndrome. When the child was cursed, the Duke gained new powers, and the family decided to weaponize his abilities, involving the royal family as well. Years later, due to the influence of high-ranking families, a villain named Colin Leveton emerged, a villain who specialized in killing other villains, becoming the #1 special operations tool. The fragmented memories ended, and Lou decided to enjoy the hot bath while things weren't so dangerous, because Cullen might turn out to be a decent person, maybe even like a hero. A few knocks came from behind the curtain, startling Lee, and a group of maids began to flood into the room, carrying a large amount of bath supplies. Caught off guard, Lee nearly submerged completely, watching the servants awkwardly. One of the maids had already rolled up her sleeves, grabbed a bath sponge, and approached the girl, ready to help her wash. A while later, Lee stood wrapped in a clean towel, her hair shimmering in the light. The girl looked at the water in the tub, which had turned very dark after she was clean, and she felt ashamed, but the maid simply comforted her. Lee examined the towel, wondering why they were using such a soft cloth to dry her body. After her bath, the maids picked out a clean dress for the girl, and she looked just like a young lady from a noble family. The little one happily looked at her hair in the mirror, as it was now a vibrant color. Afterward, the girl started twirling in her dress, and the maids were relieved to see that their young lady liked it all. A maid pulled the little one away from admiring her clothes and invited her to the dining room for dinner. Lou arrived at the dining room, where the table was already set, but she was the only one there. The girl moved closer, wanting to get a better look at what was on the table. After a moment's thought, she climbed onto a high chair. Now, Lou could see the tempting food up close. She had never seen so much delicious food before, and her eyes filled with wonder. Suddenly, Lee's stomach started making strange noises, and she tried to quiet it down while waiting for everyone to arrive for dinner. 20 minutes passed, and Lee's eyes remained fixed on the table, her mouth watering at the sight of all the food. Growing a little bolder, the little one picked up a small bread roll, wondering if she could just take a tiny bite. Lou couldn't resist taking a bite of the pastry, shocked that it had been so long since she had eaten something so delicious. She suddenly remembered her past life, having spent a long time in the hospital, which had caused her to lose her appetite, and she had barely eaten even after being reborn. The delicious food at Lou's house really whetted my appetite. I was leisurely tasting everything on my plate in the dining room when Jade appeared by the table, utterly shocked that someone so small could eat so much. I was so startled that I dropped my chicken leg, thinking, "When did you get here for dinner?" But he didn't even notice my panic and just pointed out that I was sitting in his chair. I jumped in my seat, startled. I didn't want him to have a bad impression of me. The sudden movement made the chair wobble. I started to fall backward, but Jade reacted quickly, catching me before the chair could completely tip over. He gently placed me back in my seat and helped straighten my clothes. Afterward, he pulled a chair up next to me and said I could keep sitting here. Jade looked at my hair, surprised, because it was shining brightly after being washed. The boy smelled the scent of the soap she used and realized Lou smelled of strawberries. Lou felt embarrassed by his actions and shifted her gaze to the dining table. The table was already empty. Jade noticed her sadness and tried to figure out what was upsetting her. Lesto remembered how she and her friends always shared food on the streets. It was their rule for survival, one they never broke to avoid becoming thieves. Now that Lou was in a new home, she wanted to befriend the young master, but after what happened, she was afraid he would think she was a glutton. The boy easily dispelled her worries, telling Lee to relax, as he had been watching her eat the whole time. Lee found this strange, but the boy assured her he was just curious, because after seeing her, he felt she really could survive on one meal a day. The boy's words stung Lee, because she used to have nothing to eat, and now she worried Jade had the wrong impression of her. Jade placed more food next to Lee, telling her to eat as much as she wanted, because she looked like Popo when she ate. Jade remembered Popo was his cat, who, just like Lee, loved good food and always ate more than it should. The girl looked quizzically at the piece of pie in her hand, while Jade continued to reminisce happily about his pet. When the boy admitted he really loved his pet before it passed away, Lee suddenly put down her food. Jade abruptly changed the subject, offering to take Lee to see Popo's monument, which completely terrified the little girl. Lee took a sip of juice, just out of curiosity, wanting to know what happened to Popo, as she was now a bit scared of the boy. Jade confessed that he was conducting research at the time. He had made Popo comfortable and cared for it, but the cat's time was up, and there was nothing he could do to change it. The boy's story changed Lee's impression of him, and she tried to recall other things from the book. An image of a page from the book floated into her imagination, stating that Jade avoided people and lived in his own world, which not even Colin could enter. Lee gave the boy a sweet smile, because he was just like in the book, but also a good person who knew how to care for others. The boy leaned in closer, wanting to know why Lee wanted to be friends with him. Lee admitted she was staying here because of him. If he had objected, the Duke would have thrown her out, but Cullen cherished his precious son's opinion. Her words made the boy fall into deep thought. Another round of food was brought to the table, and Jade said that siblings couldn't be friends, which dismayed Lee. But Jade wasn't teasing her. He just smiled and told her they could certainly become closer, especially with her appetite, as he would be seeing her often. Taking advantage of the light atmosphere between them, the boy decided to get some information out of the little one. He turned to her, gave her a sweet smile, and asked if the red flowers were really a gift from someone else. Jade's words stunned the little girl. She remembered the Duke and how horrified he was by the flowers she gave him. Lee once again tried to convince Jade that she hadn't stolen the flowers. The boy stroked his chin, lost in thought, confused as to why his father had decided to adopt this child. Then Jade dropped a bombshell, saying Lee might be a killer, or at least an accomplice, which completely terrified the child. The girl shook her head frantically, swearing that no one had died because of her. But Jade urged her to confess any bad things she had done, which made her start fidgeting with her dress again, unsettled. Lee told him that she was once accused of stealing a wallet, and an adult decided to punish her for it. The bad memory made Lee rub her cheek. She assured Jade that she was going to return the wallet, that it had just fallen out of someone's pocket. Hearing this, the boy was dismayed and began to feel sorry for her. Lee didn't want to reopen old wounds, but she decided to be honest with Jade, admitting she was hit a few times that day. Her answer satisfied him, and he finally realized this girl wasn't just a pawn for his father. Lee understood the whole thing was a test to see what his father was really up to. Jade asked her directly if she remembered the person who hit her, but Lee couldn't recall anything about him. The boy showed a charming smile and told the girl that if she remembered the scoundrel, she should tell him, and he would make him pay for everything he did to her. His enthusiasm didn't particularly thrill her, but she just returned a sweet smile. Late night fell on the manor, and in a secret room filled with weapons, the butler's voice echoed. Cheyenne read out the report on Lou's background before she came to the Leveton family. There were no issues with the girl's background, and the data in the report confirmed it. After Cheyenne finished reading the report, Colin sat bored in his chair, assuring the Duke that Lee was not a threat. He was still curious about why the Duke had adopted her. The boy knew that flowers like those couldn't be found anywhere else in the country, so it was no coincidence. The Duke remembered when his mother was murdered. The killer had left a large number of red morning glories as a provocation. The butler understood the Duke's plan, thinking of Lou and this potential trap, while the Duke had already concluded she was either a victim of that killer or an accomplice. Cheyenne flipped through the report again, still finding nothing strange, even though Colin had told him to pay special attention to the details. As the Duke discussed Jade's behavior with Cheyenne, a rustling sound came from by his feet. The Duke told him to leave his son alone. Colin looked down at the floor, where the body of a bound man lay next to his chair. Cheyenne apologized, saying he must have miscalculated the dose and the guy hadn't passed out. Cullen coldly pinned the criminal's head with his foot and asked him which victims he had harmed. Cheyenne admitted he hadn't finished his task of returning the bodies to their families, but the Duke was already considering how to dispose of this killer. Colin decided to scare him to death, beginning to describe how he would tear him to pieces as a gift for the victims' families. The butler placed a black glove on his master's hand, and the room filled with hoarse groans. The Duke slammed the killer's head back to the ground, and the man let out a groan of terror. Cheyenne sneered at the killer, assuring the Duke that his plan was punishment enough. Then came a sickening sound of breaking bones. Lee dreamed of her past again, in a hospital room where, despite her illness, she was always reading. She was a cheerful child who dreamed of growing up to catch bad guys. The connection with her family made her happy, especially how her parents supported her dream. But her health began to deteriorate, and her parents were terrified. At that time, the book about the Leviton family was the last one she read. Morning came, and Lee woke up in the bright sunlight, remembering her dream about the past. The little girl looked out the window, but she was still struggling with why she had so few memories of the book about the Leviton family. Lee looked around her room, which glowed green in the sunlight, and realized she was becoming increasingly suspicious of reality. The girl pinched her cheek hard to make sure she wasn't dreaming. A moment later, Lou burst into the dining room in her new clothes, wishing Jade a good morning as she ran. The boy greeted her from the dining table. The family began to eat breakfast, but the Duke was absent. Jade said he had gone to inspect the territory. This answer was enough for Lee, especially since plates of food were already being placed in front of her. But she secretly suspected the Duke was up to no good, and that inspecting the territory was just a cover. The children were eating breakfast, and just like the past few days, Jade was looking after Lou again. The little one noticed they had grown closer recently and were now calling each other by their first names. Lou was enjoying her meal, but decided it was time to learn some table manners, though she immediately wiped her mouth with her sleeve. She wanted to know Jade's plans, but he was already heading to the academy. She was disappointed because they couldn't play together. Jade glanced at the butler as if they were plotting something. Suddenly, Cheyenne appeared behind Lee and handed her a yellow balloon to cheer her up. The little one was thrilled and carefully began to play with the gift. She suddenly remembered her past again, how in the hospital her parents had given her a bunch of blue balloons to make her happy. Jade knelt beside her as Lou began to cry, but she admitted that she was happy now. The boy stroked her hair, and she thanked him for the gift, promising to always keep the little trinket with her. The butler brought a teapot and poured the hot beverage into a cup. Lee took a sip of the camellia tea. Breakfast continued in the dining room, with everyone enjoying the perfect start to the day. Cheyenne decided to give Lee a tour of the manor, mentioning that the building carried the stories of generations past. He took Lou to the garden. She already knew the Leviton family was the oldest in the empire, possessing vast territories. Lou carefully held the small trinket as Cheyenne pointed out which houses belonged to the ducal family, though most relatives had already moved away. Suddenly, Cheyenne pointed to an old shrine. Lee looked over, and Cheyenne warned her not to go near it, saying it housed the Duke's collection, but Lou knew it was actually his study. The sound of carriage wheels rumbled down the road. The girl looked around in panic, trying to figure out where the loud noise was coming from. A carriage adorned with the shrine's emblem was charging into the manor's courtyard. Lee was terrified and clung tightly to Cheyenne, who just gave her a reassuring squeeze. The carriage screeched to a halt next to Lee and Cheyenne. The noise was deafening. Maryanne jumped out of the carriage, beaming, clearly happy to see them, though Cheyenne was not impressed with the grand entrance. She walked up to him and told him that society was full of rumors about the Duke's adopted daughter. The butler was angry that they hadn't managed to suppress all the news. Maryanne smirked smugly, thinking that gossip traveled faster than newspapers these days. She recalled all the noble ladies who were always keeping a close watch on the Empire's golden bachelor, the Duke. Lee was eavesdropping on the adults' conversation when Maryanne started boasting about all the ladies who came to her for information, but Lee was drawn to the name Lady Rose. Maryanne's gaze fell on Lee, and she was visibly shocked by what Lee was wearing. Lee looked over her things, while Maryanne fumed about the outdated dress. The lady was angry that her brother hadn't prepared for a lovely little girl to be living in a house. Just then, Shy One told the lady the Duke was not home, so Maryanne scooped Lee up in her arms, deciding to take her along. The lady led Lee towards the carriage, and Cheyenne began to protest that she needed the Duke's permission. Maryanne ignored the butler's shouts and asked the little one how old she was. The lady was flustered when Lee called her ma'am and told her to just use her first name. Maryanne blew up at the butler, saying the child could pick her own clothes and that if the Duke wanted to see them, he could find them in the dressing room. The man calmly agreed to entrust the girl to the lady. The lady's carriage headed towards the city, and Maryanne recalled their first meeting. Lee sat quietly by the window, holding a yellow ball, while the lady gushed over her adorable face. The lady was very pleased with the little one and apologized for not getting to know her properly during their last meeting. Maryanne began to explain that she works at the shrine and is one of the local saintesses. Lee was completely stunned and couldn't help but gasp when she realized this lady was the very saintess everyone in the Empire adored. The lady chatted about the upcoming shopping trip and then suddenly pulled out a cigarette. Lee wrinkled her nose at the pungent smell, but thought to herself that saintesses have their own rules, and smoking wasn't forbidden there. Maryanne apologized and extinguished the cigarette. The lady gently stroked Lou's hair, and the girl began to believe she wasn't a bad person after all. The carriage arrived on the capital's main road. Lee looked out the window at the streets, amazed. The child recalled her poverty-stricken days when she would stare at the toy shop, thinking it was the height of luxury. Sometimes the shop owner would be in a bad mood and chase them away from the street. But Lee didn't run far. When the owner forgot to turn off the window lights, she would return to the shop. She would stay until dawn, just gazing at the counters full of those beautiful toys. Through the carriage window, Lee's eyes followed the shop. The little girl looked at her lady, thinking that maybe, just maybe, they could visit the shop together. Maryanne gently stroked the girl as she dreamed of touching the dolls. The carriage arrived at a high-end clothing store, the kind where all the ladies went to hunt for outfits. The lady led Lee to the door, chattering on about how many clothes she needed and for what occasions. As soon as they entered the shop, the saleswomen were ecstatic, for the saintess herself had graced them with her presence. Suddenly, all the employees rushed to the lady, greeting her like a VIP. The women began to swarm around her, asking what she wanted to buy, while Lee hid behind her skirt. Maryanne pointed to Lou and asked them to pick an outfit for her, but the girl was still worried about being thrown out of the place. The saleswomen tried to figure out who Lee was, and they were all shocked when Maryanne introduced the girl as a member of the Leveton family. Lee didn't want to come out from behind the lady while the adults were talking about the price of the clothes. The employees' words angered Maryanne, and she threatened them, telling them to stay out of the Leveton family's budget. The shop assistant was frightened by Maryanne's words and began to apologize profusely. Satisfied with her words, the lady ordered them to prepare everything worth 100 gold coins. Hearing the amount for the clothes, Lee started to calculate with her fingers, a bit embarrassed, how much that would be if she were a maid. Suddenly realizing it was a huge sum of money, Lou shouted for the lady not to spend it, but Maryanne reassured the little one. But Lee was already imagining the Duke kicking her out after discovering so much money had been spent, even though she wasn't even their biological daughter. Lee hid behind the lady's skirt again, but now she was afraid of being thrown out. The shop assistants all smiled at the girl, promising they had a large selection of clothes suitable for a young lady. But Lou became suspicious, now that even the clerks wanted to help with the shopping. Suddenly, a woman snatched the balloon from Lou's hand, confusing the girl, but the woman promised to take good care of it. The clerk tied the balloon to the window, so it wouldn't get in the way of picking out new clothes. Afterward, the saleswoman and Maryanne took Lou to the fitting room, feeling they needed to find clothes in the right size. At first, Maryanne watched them pick out dresses, but decided to have the saleswomen bring something more expensive. The lady flipped boredly through a magazine, while the clerks hurried to get new items, as she didn't want to dress the little one in cheap things. Suddenly, her spirits lifted when she spotted a new dress in a magazine, and a saleswoman happily announced that the dress was available to try on. The woman escorted Lou to the fitting room. The pink dress was a perfect fit, and the clerk explained that it was intended for a formal ball and that the princess herself had ordered a similar one. But her words made Lou increasingly worried, as her dress being similar to the princess's sounded too incredible to be true. A door sounded in the hallway outside the fitting room, and an assistant greeted Lady Rose. Lou paused, distracted by the sound, remembering that Maryanne had mentioned this name. But suddenly, Lady Rose's irritated shouts came from the hallway, demanding that her maid attend to her personally. Lady Rose continued to roar, furious that the Duke, whom she had intended to marry, had now adopted a daughter. The employee who was helping her with her dress froze nervously. Rose was more interested in gossip than trying on dresses, so she began to speculate whether Cullen's adopted daughter had magical abilities like Jade. Lo overheard their conversation and remembered the rumors Maryanne had mentioned in the estate's courtyard, and the girl realized that nobles always looked down on people. But the lady was too incensed to end the discussion, and she was now worried about how the Duke would raise his adopted daughter. Her maid chimed in, suggesting that Rose should marry the Duke's daughter off to the countryside at the right time. The lady laughed at this, thinking that the Duke's adopted daughter would have to be exceptionally beautiful to have any prospects, though she hadn't heard that she was ugly. However, the Duke had peculiar tastes and had always had a good eye for women. Lo stood in the fitting room, listening to the gossip about herself, and her mood soured when the lady shouted that she could sell the Duke's adopted daughter off to a less than desirable place at any time. The shop clerk advised her to leave the fitting room early to avoid running into the lady. In the hallway, Lo stared at the door, imagining the shadows of the cruel people she had known. She knew she had met people like that lady before, who looked down on her for her humble origins. The little girl opened the door a crack, deciding that it didn't matter what others thought of her. At that moment, Maryanne was thrilled to see Lo in her new clothes. The clerk suggested the ladies pick out matching sister outfits, an idea that made Maryanne even happier, as she had always dreamed of wearing such clothes with a girl in the family. Seeing Maryanne so happy, Lo broke into a sweet smile again. They had the little girl sit in a chair, and the clerk asked her to wait a moment while she went to get the young lady some water. Lo turned to the window, wanted to check if her balloon was safe, but it turned out the window was wide open and the balloon she had tied to it was gone. The girl screamed and ran to the window, devastated at having lost the first gift Jade had ever given her. The little girl ran outside, searching everywhere for the balloon, but there was only a crowd of passersby. Lo walked a short way down the street, realizing she had failed to keep her promise to look after the balloon. A hand reached out from a dark alley. It was a woman she didn't recognize, reaching for the girl. The hand grabbed a lock of her hair, and the strange woman told the girl to come with her, so she could have her fortune told for a lady from a wealthy family. Suddenly, the stranger grabbed the girl's arm and began insisting that she needed to know her fate from a young age and be prepared for difficulties at the right time. The woman tried to drag the girl into the alley, promising that an excellent fortune teller was waiting for her there for just 5 silver coins. Lo yanked her hand free from the woman's grasp, apologized quickly, and ran away. The girl ran through the crowd on the street, not looking back. Her heart was pounding from fear and the exhaustion of running. After a moment, Lo stopped beside an unfamiliar shop, trying to catch her breath. The little girl peeked around the corner and looked around, but she didn't see the strange woman. Lo continued on, suddenly realizing she had run all the way to the toy shop on the next street. The little girl looked at the window display, but all she wanted now was to find her yellow balloon. She wanted that balloon more than any new toy. But then it dawned on her that she didn't know where she was and was all alone. The little one decided to walk a bit further to find a familiar place and figure out her location, as she had run out of the shop without even paying for her dress. Lo passed a man and began looking around, trying to find the right way, when suddenly the man bumped into her. The girl fell to the ground, and it really hurt, but the man didn't even look back, just yelled at her to be careful. Lo got back on her feet and carefully dusted off her dress so as not to get it too dirty. But now she was afraid she wouldn't be able to find her way back and couldn't think of a new plan. Suddenly, a black shadow flashed before the girl's face, and Lo noticed it. The shadow disappeared, and Lo thought perhaps it was a bird. The next moment, a carriage came to a screeching halt beside the girl. Standing before the little one was Duke Cullen, who smiled and said she had run away from home so soon. But Lo was very happy to see him. The man admitted he had heard she ran out of the dressing room, and Lo began to panic as she had broken his rule. The little one started making excuses rapidly, explaining that while Maryanne was trying on clothes, she had gone to look for the balloon Jade had given her. The man took Lo into his arms, wanting to hear more about the balloon, and the girl started chattering again about how she had promised not to lose Jade's gift. The Duke told her to calm down, saying they could just buy a new balloon, but Lo was more worried that a promise couldn't be bought back. Lo remembered that the last time the Duke saw her, she was in rags, and she wondered how he had found her. Cullen smiled at the girl and confessed that she radiated a light that always drew his eye. The little one was a bit flustered by the sweet talk, thinking that all nobles were probably this smooth. A short while later, the Duke and Lo arrived at the shop, where the clerks were anxiously pacing near the entrance, looking for the girl. A female clerk rushed up to the Duke and started fussing that the young lady's disappearance had scared her to death, and she had almost called the police. The clerk apologized, explaining that a customer had opened the window for some air, and she was very sorry that the balloon was gone. Lady Rose rushed out of the dressing room, smiling and saying that if she had known the Duke was here, she would have booked a table. It had been a long time. The lady took a step closer, scrutinizing Lo, and asked who the little girl the Duke was holding was. Cullen remained calm, greeted the lady politely, and introduced Lo as his daughter. The woman, fanning herself, admitted she had heard the rumors that the Duke had adopted a poor orphan. The lady approached Lo again, saying they would soon be family and should be friends. But Lo didn't believe her, remembering the shouts coming from the fitting room. Despite this, the lady gave her a stern, warning look. Then she stepped back, smiled sweetly, and complimented the Duke, saying the girl was prettier than she had imagined. The Duke said he didn't care what the lady had heard, because his daughter was beautiful. The lady giggled that the Duke's charitable hobbies were admirable and immediately recommended a strict disciplinarian for his consideration. As a governess, suddenly, the lady slapped her fan against her palm, declaring that the governess was brave, could administer punishment when necessary, and could also help cover up the girl's origins. The Duke turned away from Rose and placed the little girl on the ground. The man knelt before her and asked who he was, but Lo blushed and addressed him as Duke. Cullen didn't accept this title and asked her to call him father. The little girl froze at his words. Lo remained silent, and Cullen realized she was shy about it, but he decided to ask her for a favor. The Duke looked at Rose and asked Lo to request that the lady leave the shop on her own. The lady shrieked in anger, but the Duke decided she hadn't gotten the hint he'd given her. The man stood up and demanded that the lady leave immediately and never appear before him again. Rose dramatically began to faint into her maid's arms, while Cullen decided to explain it to her in plain terms. "Get out of this shop." The lady screamed that he wouldn't dare speak to her like that, but Lo watched him happily after Cullen showed his true side. The child was pleased with how the Duke handled the lady, but he still asked her to say goodbye. The Duke leaned closer to Lo and whispered that she would never see that woman again. The little one clutched the Duke's coat, looked at the lady, and politely said goodbye. Cullen patted Lo's head, saying this was how one learned noble etiquette, but the girl was more concerned that the maids had dressed her up so beautifully. That morning, the lady stopped pretending to be ill and began pointing at Lo, threatening her with her noble status. Lo tried to smooth her own hair, but decided to tell the lady that her beauty couldn't compare to that of the ladies. Rose didn't understand, but Lo added that if she were as beautiful as the lady, she would have to marry early. After that, Lo decided to show some backbone and asked with a hint of a sneer if her looks were good enough to join the circus. Lady Rose dropped her friendly facade and hissed that only stray cats eavesdrop on others' conversations. The Duke stepped up to the lady and warned her to leave, as her behavior was now rude and insolent, like a wild cat, and she had better be careful not to make threats. Rose was furious at him acting like he owned the place and snapped at her maids, asking what they were doing cowering in the corner. The Duke walked towards the door, then turned back to her and growled that he owned this whole damn street, so if she still wanted to be near him, she had better calm down. Cullen patted Lo's head again, assuring her his threat was not meant for her. The lady decided to turn on the charm, snuggling up to the Duke and begging him for old time's sake not to be so harsh. Suddenly, the Duke grabbed the lady's arm, and she was instantly overjoyed. But the next second, the man turned her towards the door and frankly told her she shouldn't get ideas just because they had a few meals together. The man pointed to the exit, saying she could consider this a breakup on the spot, rather than him having to break her heart. The lady was still blocking the doorway, but the Duke lost his patience and, in a stern voice, demanded she get out of his shop before he called security. His words infuriated the girl, and she stormed out of the shop, her maids barely keeping up. The Duke immediately turned to Lo, wanting to know what trouble she had with the lady, but the girl decided to keep quiet to avoid making things worse. Maryanne came out of the fitting room, surprised to see her brother and the little girl. Cullen noticed his sister was wearing the same outfit from 2 weeks ago, even though he was told she was trying on new clothes. But his sister was angry with him and quickly covered his mouth with her hand to stop him from saying something inappropriate. Maryanne, embarrassed by her brother's perceptiveness, explained that fitting rooms have many uses. Cullen asked his date-loving sister not to cause him any trouble, which made Maryanne indignant, saying that even a saint could date. The girl immediately glanced at the shop exit, wondering if her brother was really dating that kind of woman. Cullen and Lo exchanged a look, and he decided to tease his sister, saying he had just been dumped. The girl was happy that she and the Duke now had something in common, and then smiled. The man asked how the shopping was going, but Maryanne had already packed her purchases into a large pile of boxes. The new things made Lo happy, but she still couldn't believe the ridiculous amount of money being spent on her. The siblings started arguing about how much they had spent and what they had bought, which made Lo feel a bit better, as she knew she wasn't the only one who thought they were spending too much. But then Cullen announced they needed to spend double, and Lo was shocked once again. The Duke promised to prepay for the purchases so the shop could prepare more silk. Lo spoke up to thank the lady for the clothes and mentioned she already had several dresses at home. But Maryanne was not satisfied that the girl's wardrobe wasn't overflowing. The Duke couldn't help but pat Lo's head again, saying that taking care of her was his responsibility as her guardian. But the little girl was very uneasy about them spending a fortune on her. The Duke went deeper into the shop to discuss with his sister which clothes they had already bought, then asked the clerk to bring out more, while Lo was still fuming over their extravagance. Suddenly, Lo came up with a plan. She pretended to be dizzy, as if she were about to faint. The man stopped and decided they should stop shopping since Lo wasn't feeling well, and the girl was thrilled that her plan had worked. Later, Lo and the Duke saw the lady to her carriage. She asked the little girl to spend more time with her, but Cullen declared that she shouldn't be mixing with children. The carriage started to move, but the lady leaned out the window to wave goodbye, promising to see her again and telling her not to worry about the Duke's words. Another carriage pulled up to the shop entrance. As Lo heard a rustling sound behind her, she was suddenly reminded of her lost balloon. An unfamiliar red-haired girl ran out of an alley, reaching out to the girl for help. Cullen managed to hide the little girl behind him, but Lo caught a glimpse of the woman's extremely pale face. The stranger took only a few steps before collapsing, dead on the pavement. Cullen knelt beside the woman, carefully examining what had happened. Lo suddenly declared that the woman must be dead. Then the girl began to speculate that with no visible injuries on the woman's body, perhaps it was just a heart attack. Cullen looked at Lo and, without denying her speculation, simply commented that she was very observant. Shortly after, a team of police arrived on the scene, and the police captain began to question the Duke about what had happened. When the commander realized who he was speaking to, he took off his hat but still warned that the interrogation would proceed by the book. The man said the victim was Bennett a Lamb, with no history of health problems, and it was likely a heart attack. The police covered the body with a sheet, for privacy. The officer said she was the daughter of a fishmonger and had several stalls at the market. Lo listened intently to the adult's conversation, but her eyes couldn't move from the body. The officer apologized for taking up the Duke's time and bowed as the carriage headed for the estate. Back in the carriage, Lo remembered a book that said the capital had the highest rate of crime and bizarre deaths in the entire empire. Now she wished she had finished the whole book. The Duke watched his daughter closely. He remembered how brave she was when they first met, but now something had scared her. Lo flashed back to the strange woman in the alley, who had reached out her hand and told her to come with her to learn her fate. The girl also remembered that she had touched her hair. Then she had grabbed her hand and started chattering about future dangers and the importance of knowing what was to come. Lo glanced at the Duke and tried to calm down, just shrugging and saying that these things happen. But the girl's hands were shaking, so she had to clasp them tighter and assure the man she was fine. It was late at night when the carriage finally arrived at the Leveton family estate. The butler immediately opened the front door and bowed politely to welcome his master. The Duke and Lo walked past Cheyenne, and the guy was stunned when they appeared in the house together. but his master just said he had picked her up on the way. Jade came down from the second floor, happy to see his father back. The guy asked why Lo had returned with his father and began to worry that something terrible might have happened. This made Lo flinch a little. Cullen walked past his son and casually mentioned that something did happen, which made his son even more curious. Jade turned to the little girl when she said his name again. The girl looked down at the floor and admitted she had lost her little ball. Jade and Lo sat on the stairs as she told the whole story of how her gift was lost. In the end, Lo was upset again about not finding her balloon, but Jade just looked at her calmly. The guy patted her head and told her not to worry about something so easily replaced, but she really liked that balloon. Jade stood up and suggested they go horseback riding soon, which surprised her, as he was trying to cheer her up. He held out his hand to Lo, offering to take her to her room so she could rest before dinner. She looked at his outstretched hand, then rubbed her eyes with her fists as if in disbelief. But the next moment, her face lit up like the sun, and she took Jade's hand. In his study, the Duke placed a glass on the table and assured Cheyenne that he hadn't noticed anything unusual about Lo's behavior. Cullen told the butler that whatever had happened, it was a good thing Lo was safe and sound. The Duke summoned the dark essence of a snake into his palm, whispering that they were lucky it turned out well, only because they had managed to summon that shadow. The man took another sip and sighed, because raising a child was so difficult. He slammed the empty glass back on the table. Dinner was over, and the Duke decided to relax with some music, so he started the record player. Lo was fascinated by the thing, as it was the first time she had seen a gramophone powered by a magical artifact. Then Lo turned to Jade and asked how old he was. She was shocked to find out the boy was only 14. She had thought he was older, which made her wonder why he was drinking. But he told her that their family barely touched alcohol or drugs. Lo thought she could try the drink too, but Cullen refused her, saying she was only half Jade's age, so no. The little one touched her head and fell in a deep thought. Jade asked what she was thinking, but Lo just gave him a sweet smile and promised she would grow up fast. Cheyenne walked into the living room with a tray, interrupting Cullen, who was drinking. The butler presented the Duke with the tray, which was filled with sealed letters containing classified intelligence. The Duke tore open the large envelope and began to carefully read the report inside. As Cullen's eyes scanned the document, he realized the prince had sent him a real puzzle. A woman had died of a heart attack on the street, and there were similar cases in the capital. The man opened a second envelope and began to deduce that a second incident could be written off as a coincidence, but a third definitely required police intervention. The information in the envelope indicated that 3 women had died in different locations. They were from different social classes, but all had red hair. Cullen considered this new task, then broke into a confident smile, feeling that everything would be fine. Lo thought to herself that Cullen would be going hunting soon, and although that was a good thing, she felt something was a little off, which the Duke noticed. The man took off his gloves, worried that the girl didn't look well, and then he placed his palm on her forehead to check her temperature. Suddenly, a kaleidoscope of colors flashed before Lo's eyes, and her gaze froze. An image from a book flashed in her mind, which said that on August 9th, the madman's new victim would be an orphan girl. The murderers lured the girl into a trap, promising she could learn everything about her mother through a fortune-teller's ritual. Sadly, the girl, who only knew her mother's name, followed the strangers. The orphan found herself locked in a cage and, to her horror, was treated differently from the other victims. The murderer looked at the girl with a saw in his hand, fascinated by her unusual hair color. Her thoughts began to clear, and Lo started to hear the voices of the Leveton family, trying to bring her back to her senses. Finally, she could see them. Cheyenne asked if she remembered today's date. Lo knew it was August 9th, just like in her memory. She quickly pinched herself. She remembered that in the book, on this day, a poor orphan named Lo was murdered. In the Leveton family storybook, there was a chapter called The Fortune Teller Murders, which began by saying the killer had lived under his mother's strict control since childhood, his life like being in a cage. The killer loved his mother and hated her, so at some point, he really messed her up. And so, in a cognitive dissonance that severely disturbed his mind, he realized his desire. The killer suddenly understood that he himself wanted to be a mother. Now, his twisted obsession drove him to find women who resembled his mother, so he created the identity of a fortune teller, selling a magical beauty product. The women used it, and their appearances changed, becoming mesmerized by themselves in the mirror. Their cheeks temporarily flushed, and their skin improved. But death eventually came for them, as the bottle was laced with a poison that slowly but surely caused heart failure. Lo stopped trembling, but now she clutched her nightgown tightly, realizing that if the women's deaths were not accidental, then the fortune teller she saw on the street must be the killer. The girl snuggled closer to the Duke, eager no more. The child tried to clarify that if all the crimes were connected, then the victims must have something else in common. The man pondered this, but he didn't quite understand what the girl was getting at. Lo was thinking about the red hair, but she couldn't mention the fortune teller directly, so she vaguely asked if the women had visited a fortune teller, a question that piqued Jade's interest. The girl explained that all fortune tellers came from poor families, but even nobles sometimes visited well-known ones, even in the darkest slums. Leah looked at Cullen and continued to persuade him that while the rich usually go to restaurants and boutiques, a fortune teller's home is a place people of all social statuses would visit. He pondered her suggestion, thinking it was worth looking into. Leah clutched her head again, feeling a sharp pain. Cullen told Cheyenne to contact the Intelligence Guild, but he then saw the child curled up in pain on the sofa. He held Leah's head, tried to wake her, but she didn't seem to hear his voice. Her eyes slowly closed, and her consciousness began to blur again, sinking into darkness. Then, she remembered another chapter from the book. At this moment, the poor orphan with an injured arm was dying in a cage, while the killer hummed a song, wearing a red wig. The orphan's eyes were lifeless. She had lost an arm, and the intense pain made her wish the pervert would just get over with. To finish her off, Cullen infiltrated the killer's lair, calmly reading a report on the red hair fetish. Cullen rushed towards the killer, who was dressed as a red-haired woman. The killer jumped up. Cullen summoned his shadow magic, and a black rope wrapped around the killer's mouth, silencing him. The assassin tried to resist, but soon fell to the ground. Cullen approached him, the shadow serpent still tightly sealing the man's mouth as he took his last few breaths. The Duke swore to finish off this killer with his own hands, to tear him to pieces. His gaze fell upon a cage in a dark corner of the room. The floorboards creaked as he approached, but the girl in the cage didn't even notice him. Cullen carried her out of the cage. He felt sorry for her and decided to take her to a healer immediately. As the man bent down towards the little orphan girl, a metal arrow suddenly pierced his chest with incredible speed, and he staggered. The Duke regained his footing, but drops of blood were already blossoming on his dark cloak. A moment later, the man collapsed to the ground in front of the terrified girl. The assassin approached with a sinister grin, looking at the orphan, expecting his reward. The memory gradually faded, and Leah woke up in her own bed, her heart pounding wildly. She shot up, gasping for air. Cullen turned to face her. Everyone stared at Leah, who was still trembling slightly, as Cullen gently rubbed her back, checking if she was all right. Leah's face turned pale as she realized she wasn't the only one caught up in this murder case. Another clear memory flashed through her mind. The Duke, after being hit by the arrow, lying unconscious in bed. A famous healer examined the Duke's body and gave a grim diagnosis. The arrow was coated with a potent poison. Jade brought in one healer after another to try and save his father, but they were all powerless. Jade fell into deeper despair, lashing out at them in anger. A month passed, and the Duke remained unconscious, with the healers completely at a loss. These events sparked numerous rumors, and Jade had to deal with a crowd at the manor's gate demanding to know the latest news. Among these people, some were indebted to the Duke's family, while others simply wanted to make a good impression on the young master and win his favor. But there were also dangerous elements in the crowd, armed with knives, plotting to overthrow the Leveton family. The memory began to fade, and Leah remembered the last thing from her previous life. The last time she had fallen unconscious, she had dropped a book, and her parents were outside the emergency room, comforting each other heartbrokenly. The memory cut off, and a desperate Leah began to beat her own head, regretting that she had told the Duke about the fortune teller. Jade grabbed Leah's hands, pulling them away, and asked if she had come to her senses. Everyone was worried about her. Leah looked around her room and said she was fine now. Cheyenne wiped Leah's face with a damp cloth, asking her to state her condition, but the girl felt strange under everyone's gaze. While she was unconscious, The butler had told Jade to go to sleep since Leah was fine, which had stung Jade a little. The little one was shocked, not expecting Jade to be so worried about her that he had waited for her to wake up. There was a knock at the door, and Cheyenne went to the maid, taking the documents from her hand. The butler said, "Your Grace, the investigation results you requested are here," and handed him the envelope. Cullen tore open the envelope and began to read the report. Leah couldn't help but peek at the document. It contained a full report on the victim's activities, and the girl began to worry that if there was information about the fortune teller inside, Cullen would go to her that very night. Leah decided to act to stop the Duke from leaving, so she grabbed his shirt with all her might. He looked up from the document, wondering what she was up to. Leah had no time to think of an excuse, and she grew more anxious, but she didn't want to reveal that she knew about the Duke's affairs from a book she had read in her past life. The girl squeezed her eyes shut, but the Duke calmly asked her to tell him what she wanted. Leah tried to muster her strength and gripped Cullen's hand again, but all she could do was lift her tear-streaked face to the Duke and beg him in a pitiful voice not to go anywhere. The Duke methodically flipped through the intelligence agency's report. He found a key detail. All the victims were clients of a fortune teller in the slums, a red-haired woman known as the Scarlet Witch. Cullen realized the information Leah had given him was exactly the same, and now the whole thing reeked of a trap. As he reviewed the document, Leah still held the Duke's hand. A moment later, the girl squeezed his hand, pulling his attention back to her. With a tear-streaked face and a pleading voice, Leah begged him to stay home. The child began to tremble. A stack of documents slipped from his hand with a soft rustle, and he had no idea what was happening. The papers scattered on the floor as the men tried to soothe her, while she was now crying her heart out. She clung to Cullen, crying out that her dreams always came true, so her recent dream of the Duke getting hurt was bound to happen. Leah clutched his shirt in her fists, pleading with the Duke to stay with her for just one night. The girl wiped her eyes, but the surrounding silence made her think she had angered him again. Cullen calmly confessed that the girl's emotions were his top priority right now and agreed to stay at the manor. Leah worried the Duke would kick her out for being angry, but she couldn't understand why he would do that to her. Suddenly, the child had an emotional breakdown, and Jade tried to soothe her by stroking her head, but she couldn't stop. Cheyenne watched the scene in the room with a serious expression, saying nothing. Leah couldn't stop sobbing, so the Duke ordered the butler to fetch a sedative. After a while, Jade asked if Leah was okay, but she was so ashamed of her earlier behavior that she looked mortified. The door was pushed open abruptly, and Cheyenne appeared in the room with the medicine on a tray. He offered the girl a glass of sedative, but she refused, promising she would be fine as long as the Duke stayed home. Jade also begged her to drink the medicine, as Leah was feeling a bit nauseous. To convince her, he and Cheyenne pretended that if she didn't drink it, they would have to call a doctor for surgery. The girl snatched the cup. She remembered her experience in the hospital from her past life and didn't want to be on an operating table again. Leah squeezed her eyes shut and downed the entire glass of medicine in one gulp, trying to forget everything. A second later, she grimaced at the bitter taste, but the medicine was down. The butler wiped her face and praised her, and Jade brought a chocolate candy as a reward. Leah could have done it herself, but the Duke seized on her words, slyly asking why she couldn't sleep alone. The girl then patted the bed and firmly declared that she would sleep. Next to the Duke, Jade started talking to his father, saying that even though Leah wasn't related to them by blood, they were so alike that even her crying seemed orchestrated. The Duke patted the bed, trying to get Leah's attention and have her lie down to rest for a bit. Leah stood there emotionally, determined not to fall asleep before the night was over. The Duke decided to get his way through cunning and slipped under the covers. Leah followed suit but assured the man she would only lie next to him and not actually fall asleep. Jade was completely taken aback when the older man invited him to join them too. Jade tried to make an excuse to decline, but Leah's eyes lit up and she became sunny again. After a few complaints, Jade decided to get under the covers with them. Cheyenne turned off the lights and promised he would be nearby. If they needed him, they just had to ring the bell. It was late and quiet outside, and Leah's room fell into darkness. The girl lay in the middle, thinking that they were now more like a family than ever before. Thoughts troubled her. She didn't know how an adopted daughter was supposed to fit in, but she wanted to have a dream where they were a family. Leah rubbed her eyes, and Jade told her to sleep while she was drowsy, as that was the effect of the medicine. The little one yawned. She already knew she had been tricked and demanded the Duke promise not to leave even if she fell asleep. Her eyes closed on their own from exhaustion, and the bedroom ceiling began to blur. Leah didn't press the matter further, thinking she would report the criminal to the police in the morning, and then fell asleep. A little while later, Cullen came to the main hall, where Cheyenne helped him get dressed, as the Duke was lost in thought. Cullen noticed that Jade liked Leah and cared for her deeply. He smiled. Leah was no longer a mystery to him now, seeing her so worried and ready to protect him. The Duke walked towards the door, wanting to go to the fortune-teller's place to see if it was a trap. Cheyenne handed him his cane. The Duke told him that if he didn't return, then Leah was definitely a spy sent by his mother's killer. Cullen turned to the butler, implying that such matters needed to be kept secret. Dawn broke, and the Duke stepped outside, already anticipating a very interesting hunt. A dead silence filled Leah's bedroom, where the girl slept soundly in her bed. Sunlight streamed through the curtains onto her face, waking her. She groggily got up, planning to go to the police before the Duke woke up. But she suddenly realized her bedroom was empty and the Duke had been gone for some time. Leah climbed out of bed and accidentally stepped on a stack of files detailing the deceased women. The girl quickly grabbed the papers and began to study them, trying to find something important. Immediately after, she rushed over to the sofa. Jade was sleeping there. She began to shake him hard, and when he woke up, he had no idea what was happening. Jade rubbed his eyes wearily and told her his father had left at dawn to verify some intelligence. Leah screamed in anger. She knew the Duke wouldn't listen to her, yet she had let herself fall asleep last night. Leah jumped next to Jade and eagerly asked if he could ride a horse. Her eyes were filled with determination as she declared she had a request that must be fulfilled. Jade didn't know what was happening, but he could ride, and before taking action, he needed to know what Leah was planning. The girl began to plead with him not to ask questions, to just trust her, and that she would repay him later. The man watched Leah intently, trying to figure out her scheme. But the next second, he gave in, agreeing to help her in a drawn-out voice. Leah didn't wait, grabbing his hand and dragging him from the bedroom to the stables. When they reached the stables, the little one was speechless. Standing before her was a majestic horse, black as the dark night, with a long mane. Jade began to fit the horse with racing gear, while Leah sized up the animal with a mix of excitement and anxiety, as it was several times taller than her. The man leaped nimbly into the saddle, and the horse stood calmly, awaiting orders. Jade reached out his hand to Leah, inviting her to get on. The little one was small. She grabbed Jade's hand with both of hers and tried to climb onto the horse. The horse galloped through the capital's market streets, forcing people to jump out of the way. Leah clung tightly to the horse's mane, holding on for dear life with a look of terror on her face, screaming nonstop. Jade continued to ride down the street, the wind whipping his face, but he couldn't hear what Leah was shouting in the wind as she clung tightly to the horse's mane. Jade leaned down slightly to check on Leah, but she wouldn't even open her eyes. But suddenly, Leah mustered the courage to look around and pointed towards an alley. Jade reined in the horse and turned it in that direction. The horse charged into the desolate alley, which was in the city's slums. Dark clouds gathered over the fortune-teller's house, and the place looked completely abandoned. Jade followed Leah, recognizing the fortune-teller's house, but he didn't understand why they had come here to find his father. He slowed his pace and looked around. He felt that his father was definitely not here and that Leah needed to calm down. A muffled thud made the children tense up. Determined, Leah walked towards the door, wanting to check the house. Jade grabbed her hand, had a bad feeling, and needed a moment to compose himself. He demanded an answer from Leah, wanting to know exactly how much she knew about this place. The girl reminded him that he had promised not to ask unnecessary questions and to just help her. Jade steadied his breath, reluctantly accepting that Leah was holding him to his promise. He then carefully let go of the girl's hand, letting her act on her own. Leah listened to the noises behind the closed door, but they stopped immediately. She began to worry for Cullen's safety. She imagined there might be accomplices with weapons in the room, hiding to evade capture. Leah turned to Jade and ordered him to run immediately if he saw anyone behind the door, even though she knew he was stronger than an average adult. The little girl reached for the doorknob with a trembling hand. She suddenly remembered her vision, the killer from the book standing right in front of her, smiling wickedly. Leah froze at the door, her hand tight on the knob, but all the thoughts in her head were screaming about how scared she was to be here. Suddenly, she threw the door open and it slammed against the wall. She was more worried for Cullen's safety than her own life. The first thing I saw were thick drops of blood splattered on the floor at the Duke's feet. Next to him, The killer's legs dangled in the air, shrouded in a black mist. The killer was dressed in the fortune-teller's clothes, still with red hair, but a black noose was around his neck, causing him to cough up blood. The Duke faced the killer, using his dark magic to pull him towards the ceiling. The man tightened the noose, forcing the culprit's body higher towards the roof, so he desperately tried to escape the trap with his last bit of strength. Leah couldn't help but gasp, forcing the Duke to turn his attention to her and loosen his grip on the rope. Jade was shocked that the killer had been disguised as someone else. As the assassin tried to break free, Cullen tightened his grip on the magic rope and then ordered Jade to grab Leah and leave the house. He held Leah, trying to cover her eyes so she wouldn't see anything horrible, but the girl began to struggle against him. Leah watched in horror through Jade's fingers, terrified, not understanding who would shoot the arrow at the Duke if everyone left. Her gaze fell on the assassin's twitching hand as the culprit tried to escape the trap again. Just as Jade had almost carried the girl outside, she suddenly understood what the arrow trap was. Leah broke free from Jade's arms and ran back to the Duke to warn him. The sound of her hurried footsteps echoed in the room as she tried to shout to the Duke, who was completely focused on the assassin. The girl ran to his side and grabbed his arm, forcing the man to lose his concentration. The next moment, an arrow that was meant for someone else pierced Leah's back, and the startled Duke let the culprit escape from his trap. The assassin watched as his secret arrow trap was triggered, a slight smile on his face. Leah collapsed into Cullen's arms, while a completely terrified Jade rushed down the stairs. Cullen caught the little one, trying to keep her conscious. The girl's eyes were squeezed shut as a sharp pain shot through her body. Jade practically flew to his father, who was trying to get Leah to focus and stay awake. The Duke pleaded with Leah to look at him, but she was exhausted and her shoulder burned with pain. Jade leaned over Leah, assuring her that everything would be all right, but his face was etched with fear. Suddenly, Leah remembered her past life again. Her parents had looked at her the same way, promising everything would be fine. The memory shifted, and now she was being pushed into an operating room, her body on the verge of giving out, and the last thing she wanted to do was reach out to her parents. Leah's mind was racing, but she managed to reach out and touch Cullen's face, calling him Dad in a faint voice. Leah was completely losing consciousness, so all she could do was apologize for everything. The Duke was stunned, but he snapped out of it when Leah's hand slipped from his cheek and his heart broke. Jade was terrified, pleading with Leah to wake up. He started shaking her, but she was already unconscious. Although they needed to act quickly, Cullen just sat there, holding Leah tightly. Cheyenne appeared calmly at the fortune-teller's place, but he was there to announce that the young master and young lady were missing. But when the butler saw the Leveton family and the injured Leah on the floor, he nearly had a heart attack. The Duke pulled Leah closer again, but he was numb, lost in memories of the past. Cullen flashed back to his father's face, the way he accused him of being a curse. Cullen's father was jealous of his son's magical abilities and was always prejudiced against him. So in retrospect, he realized with disgust that he had made a deal with a devil he hadn't even summoned. But deep down, the head of the family feared his son, so he never hesitated to show his power and keep him in line with punishments. Cullen's mother loved him dearly, so whenever he buckled under his father's pressure, she would always pull him close, shielding him from the blows. Holding her son, she always promised to be by his side, and that Cullen should never doubt her love. But even her love couldn't save him, so she began to take all the blows from the head of the family herself. When the Duke's mother died, a heartbroken young Cullen realized his world had shattered. The Duke's thoughts were pulled from the distant memory as he realized that, just like back then, his world was collapsing again as little Leah lost consciousness in his arms. The man looked at the little girl, knowing he had adopted the beggar girl on a whim. But what bothered him was that he didn't know why she had saved his life from that arrow. The man leaned closer to Leah's face, wondering why she didn't hate him after seeing some of the things he had done. Cheyenne shouted, kneeling beside the Duke, pulling Cullen back to reality and making him look around. Jade and Cheyenne didn't hide their fear, waiting for the Duke to take action. The Duke turned to the butler as a plan began to form in his mind. He nodded towards the culprit and ordered Cheyenne to take him to the dungeon. The butler acted immediately, glaring at the killer, ready to do whatever his master asked. Cullen handed Leah to Jade, telling him to stop the bleeding from her shoulder and find something for her to bite on so she wouldn't injure her tongue. Jade tore off one of his own shirt sleeves with his teeth to make a tourniquet. Cullen summoned a magical shadow with healing abilities. Leah flinched as the magic washed over her body, biting down hard on the tourniquet. The girl groaned as she was stretched by the power of the shadow. The magical shadow dissipated, and Leah's breathing became much calmer, but her eyes remained closed. The Duke checked on her and calmed down when he saw the bleeding had stopped. The man looked around for the butler to help carry the little one to safety. Cheyenne was trying to tie up the killer with a rope when Cullen shouted that he was heading to the family's inn. The child was taken to an inn room, where Cullen and Jade anxiously waited for a healer to examine her. The Duke faced the bed, demanding an explanation for his child's condition. The healer packed up his tools and admitted that for now, the girl's condition was stable, but without a surgeon, he couldn't fully assess the danger. The healer was relieved that the arrow wasn't poisoned and had missed the heart, but the Duke was unmoved and approached the bed. Cullen stared at Leah's pale face and threatened to eradicate all the healers in the city if she died. The terrified doctor quickly bowed to the Duke and promised to do everything possible to help Leah recover. The Duke carefully sat on the bed, trying not to disturb the girl's body. He was lost in thought, overwhelmed by the emotions he was experiencing, and long-buried memories resurfaced. For a long time, he had believed Leah was either targeting the Red Flower or was a spy sent to assassinate him. Kalen smiled smugly, realizing he had obtained valuable information the previous night, and that everything about the girl was just a coincidence. But the thought of her calling him Dad lingered in his mind. He gently caressed the girl's cheek, still in disbelief that she would use her own body to block that arrow for him. He brushed her hair aside, deciding to take care of her, even if Leah was setting a trap for him now. Kalen was also worried about this bond of affection that had already formed. Just like Leah, he now felt a great sense of responsibility. The Duke held the little girl's hand and vowed to adopt her and make her his daughter, even if she was protecting an enemy. He squeezed Leah's hand, determined that when she woke up, he would raise her well so that she could walk proudly by even if he were struck down. Kalen kissed the girl's hand and decided it was best to let her stay in this hotel room so she could wake up sooner. But days passed, and the doctors had transformed the hotel room into a temporary ward with curtains drawn around the bed. Kalen watched the group of healers gathered at the door, not interfering as they discussed her treatment plan. But his face was etched with the agony of waiting painfully for news. The Duke sat down on the living room sofa, and Shane anxiously inquired about the young lady's health. The doctor said she was out of danger, but Jude had become withdrawn and shut himself off after the incident. Shane brought the Duke a drink and explained that his son had been waiting for the medical procedures to end, so he had now gone to rest. The butler poured a glass of wine and mentioned that the young master was in a fragile state. At this moment, the Duke took the cup, wondering when the priest from the temple could arrive at the earliest to heal the girl with their magic. Shane explained that the kingdom was celebrating the temple's festival, so the high priests were all there, but they would rush to the manor as soon as the festival ended. Kalen took a sip and, in a cold tone, told Shane to convey his warning to the king. The man slammed the cup down, promising that if the king didn't send the priests immediately, he would personally appear at the royal palace. The Duke paused, then his eyes flashed crimson as he added that any royal children he encountered in the palace would pay for what had happened to his daughter. Leah lay quietly in bed, having been unconscious for a long time. Jude waited in agony, looking exhausted from his long vigil by Leah's bedside. The boy recalled the day he entered the empty study of his family's manor. A strange, furry little creature flew across the room, and he spotted it. Jude was just a child then, but the little thing piqued his curiosity. The creature looked a bit like a kitten, but with small wings on its back, and it was looking at him with anticipation. The boy picked up the animal and examined the strange little cat closely. His father appeared in the study and told him that the creature in Jude's hands was a chimera. A chimera is a creature that shares its life with one master, a being that can feel all the feelings of its partner. The chimera curiously sniffed the boy's face, and his father told Jude that he was now responsible for taking care of this new pet. The little animal was adorable, and Jude remembered the words that the chimera was now his other self, and he needed to care for it as he would himself. Jude approached Leah's bed, studying her face, thinking how much she resembled Bobo now. The boy gently caressed the girl's cheek. He missed her, but she was still different from his chimera. He remembered the day he gave her the balloon. At this moment, he really missed her smile, but the happy memory gradually faded, replaced by another image, her being pierced by that arrow again. Her action filled Jude with questions. With every thought, he grew sadder. He couldn't understand why he hadn't trusted her, and how she dared to protect his father. Overwhelmed by emotion, the boy felt an inexplicable heaviness in his chest. Jude buried his head in the bed, his emotions so intense that he gripped the sheets tightly, trying to ease the longing for Laia. The room echoed with groans and sobs from a healer, pleading to be allowed to see his family. Laia opened one eye, strangers still surrounding her, discussing their options for returning home. The little one looked around. Her bed was enclosed by white curtains, blocking the harsh sunlight. She slowly tried to piece together the past events, remembering how she had saved Kaelin from the arrow. Laia tried to say something, but having been silent for so long, her voice was hoarse and indistinct. Suddenly, she panicked, thinking she had died again, and violently threw off the blanket, tears already streaming down her cheeks. But when she saw a black head beside her, she immediately calmed down. Jude was sleeping next to her face, his head buried in his arms. The girl was startled on the bed and slowly crawled towards the boy, immensely relieved to be alive. Jude was sleeping soundly. Laia sat opposite him, careful not to wake him, curious as to why he was by her bed. The boy moved, opened his eyes, and tried to figure out who was moving near him. The boy woke up instantly, propping himself up with his hands, and said in the most charming voice that he really missed his princess. His action caught Laia off guard, and she could only stare at him, dumbfounded. Then her expression relaxed, she calmed down, and gave the boy the cutest smile she could muster. Laia waved her arms, happily shouting that she had made it, and that no one had died from the poisoned arrow. Damn it, Jude watched her dance around but couldn't understand a single word, as all that came from her throat were hoarse sounds. The boy looked at her with relief, but his eyes still held a deep sadness, which calmed Laia down a bit. Jude poured a glass of water, his sense of detachment feeling very strange to Laia. He handed her the water, and Laia snatched it, but Jude told her to drink slowly. The water made Laia feel much better, and she was almost ready to get back to normal. The boy took the cup, trying to remain calm, but Laia had a ton of questions, and from Jude's words, she realized they were in a hospital. Jude leaned in closer and told her the Duke was fine, although Laia had been unconscious for a whole week. Laia's joy turned to worried surprise. She didn't understand why so much time had passed. Suddenly, Jude jumped up, yanked open the curtains, and shouted that Laia was back. The little girl peeked out from behind the boy, curious about the visitors in the room. A group of healers was gathered around the bed, trying to calm the head doctor, but now they looked at the children, their faces pale and worried. Afterwards, they began to hug each other, thrilled that they would soon be able to see their families and return to their lives. The head doctor asked Jude how he got into the room, but he just coldly evaded the question. The whole thing was strange to Laia, so she asked Jude about the strangers in the room. Jude explained that all these doctors, who had initially promised to heal her quickly, examined her shoulder and found no poison on the arrow. But the doctors messed up. There was a potion on the arrow they didn't detect, so the Duke threatened them that they would either heal you or lose everything. Because of their mistake, Laia's life was in danger. Jude tried to visit her, but each visit was filled with worry for the girl's life. Hearing the boy's story, Laia got goosebumps and shivered at the thought of what could have happened to her, and how lucky she was. Jude glared at her, not sharing in the joy of this luck, because she had been in a very dangerous situation after being hit by that arrow. The girl tried to joke lightly that since the potion wasn't decisive, they might as well leave it to fate and stay optimistic. Her words made the boy relax a little, and he admitted that it all felt like some kind of miracle. Laia pointed at the doctors, still not quite understanding why they were so happy about, surviving. A group of adult healers were hugging and crying, while Jude reminded Laia that their father could be very difficult. Jude remembered Shane being with their father on that terrible day, and even the butler seemed terrified by the Duke's actions. Shane tried to calm the Duke down, but he was furious and extremely emotional that someone had sacrificed themselves to save him. Kaelin paced the room, saying he would make someone pay if Laia didn't get better. Laia was deeply moved by this story, touched that the Duke had been so worried about her. While explaining how angry the Duke was, Jude started rummaging under Laya's bed. Apparently, if the doctors couldn't wake Laya up, the Duke was prepared to draw lots to punish them. The boy took out a box, and the little one started rummaging inside for a slip of paper, while Jude finished the story of how Kaylin would randomly punish one of the doctors to motivate the others. Laya pulled out a slip of paper, imagining it as some sort of punishment game against the doctors, and she was intrigued. The girl unfolded the paper, but on it was drawn a giant skull, meaning whoever drew it would be punished by death. Jude laughed and said Laya had hit the jackpot, but his joke was far from the girl's terrified mood. Laya clutched the paper in her hand, furious that such a punishment could even be conceived, as the doctors were not criminals. Jude smiled gently. He agreed that all the doctors were the best in the entire capital and had been summoned as soon as the incident occurred. Laya wondered how the royal family could allow this, but the boy admitted that the royal family had actually helped organize all the treatment. The girl imagined the Duke sitting on the throne, being cared for by the royal family, and her fantasy told her that the Duke's family was more important than the king's. A faint rustling sound in the room caught the children's attention. The best doctors in the capital lined up, requesting to perform a physical examination on a young lady. The head doctor examined her under Jude's supervision and asked the girl not to overuse her injured shoulder, promising to come back later for another checkup. Jude jumped in front of the man, aggressively asking if he was sure about the diagnosis, which scared the doctor into a sweat as he assured, in a trembling voice, that the young lady would make a full recovery. The other doctors began to bow deeply to the young lady, thrilled that she was the luckiest girl in the entire kingdom. The doctors waited near the exit, hoping to ask for permission to leave, but they were frozen with fear. Jude nodded for them to leave, but warned them that he had personally supervised the drawing of lots, and that they were all very lucky today. The healers started crying again, emotionally thanking the young master for his mercy. The crowd began to surge towards the door, but Jude shouted after them that only her father could approve their departure. Suddenly, Laya lunged at the boy, grabbing his jacket and demanding that he not hide the truth about what happened while she was sick. The boy set the girl back on the bed, preparing to tell his story. From what the adults told him, Jude understood that the fortune teller's house was filled with traps, but only one was triggered. That trap was a loaded crossbow, activated by a ring that the fortune teller had to turn in the correct way. A turn to the right would fire an arrow with a deadly poison, while a turn to the left meant an arrow with a potion. When the Duke put a noose around the culprit and started hoisting him towards the ceiling, the trap mechanism was triggered. But the culprit failed to turn the ring the right way. So luckily for her, Laya was still alive because the arrow that hit her was loaded with the potion. Hearing all this, Laya's joy vanished, as the danger she had been in was too close for comfort. The little one started to think about the book, in which the Duke was shot by a poisoned arrow. Just like her, the children stayed together, and Jude detailed the killer's motive to Laya. The guy was so obsessed with his mother that he started killing women who looked like her. Laya was piecing together the contents of the book with what Jude was telling her when the boy suddenly got angry, admitting he was annoyed that the killer was finished off so quickly. Laya was frightened and completely stunned, as she had no idea what other perverted things the killers in this world were capable of. Jude repeatedly assured her that his father had made the killer pay dearly, so she had nothing to worry about now. The boy squeezed her shoulder, worried that Laya's wound might still be hurting. Jude started rambling about how terrible the wound was, how deep it was, and how Laya could have died at any moment. He sounded agitated, and Laya imagined herself as a toy with a limb torn off. She suddenly pulled her hand away from Jude's, and then became scared, worrying that she might never fully recover and would be left with a crippled arm forever. The boy promised that after a large group of priests treated her wound, she wouldn't feel any pain and everything would be fine. Laya didn't want to know how much trouble she had caused her family, to the point where they even had to call on the most precious priest from the temple to heal her. But Jude just told her to make a donation to the temple, saying Maryanne would appreciate it. Jude kept patting Laya's head. He had missed her so much during that time. But the happy times didn't last long. The girl hadn't gotten answers to all her questions, so due to the lack of information, she clutched her dress tightly, preparing to question Jude. The boy stroked Laya's hair again, demanding she answer why she did something so reckless. The boy knew that if the arrow had hit his father, he would have still lived, but Laia fabricated that the arrow would still be dangerous if it hit the heart. Laia was glad that everything was fine now, and her bravery made Jude incredibly proud of the girl. His words made the little one embarrassed, and she tried to justify herself by saying she didn't want to see Shane and Jude sad if something bad happened to the Duke. The boy realized she had just lied to him, but for the sake of her smile, he didn't press for the truth. Jude bowed his head and apologized to Laia for not trusting her from the beginning, which ended up putting them in danger. Laia suddenly realized that in her haste, she hadn't even thought of an excuse for running to that fortune teller's place. Her face turned pale. She couldn't tell the boy that she knew all this from a book from another life. Jude tried to ask Laia some questions, but she started bouncing on the bed, demanding food, saying she had used up too much energy while unconscious. A while later, the girl sat contentedly on the bed, having just finished a large meal. But her peace was shattered when Jude said he could send a messenger to find the Duke and call him to the hospital. Laia grabbed the boy's jacket again, frantically shouting not to do that, not to bother the Duke with important matters, just because she hadn't thought of an excuse yet. A dark cloud hung over Laia, and she was almost convinced the Duke would dispose of her harshly for knowing too much about his secret life as a special professional. Jude didn't understand her, nor why she didn't want to see her father. Laia started to distract Jude, saying she was concerned about the Duke's affairs, but that she would be happy to see him if he came on his own. Jude suspected she was lying and directly asked Laia if she believed her father had come to see her every day. The boy saw the doubt on the girl's face, so he decided to pinch her cheek and assured her that her father had only been away for a short while, but he had always been nearby. The girl's mind raced. She was willing to believe that since Kalen came every day, he might not be so angry with her anymore. Jude went to the door, promising they would talk about everything after her father returned. The door slammed shut, leaving Laia alone in the huge hospital room. Now she didn't have much time to think of an excuse, but as a backup plan, she decided to pretend she didn't remember anything. But she knew the Duke had a sharp mind, and such an obvious lie would surely not save her. So, Laia held her head and began to think. The Duke and Shane were searching the alley where the fortune teller's house was located when they stumbled upon a new clue. In the house where the killer had planned the murders, there were large piles of the same red flowers Laia had once brought. Kalen was furious that the police had let the crime scene be compromised. He carefully examined the flowers and then noticed they had been there for some time. Suddenly, Kalen's gaze was caught by something in a pile of petals. The man's face darkened, and he told Shane to get the police to this house. Amidst the large clusters of flowers, a hand was sticking out. The Duke realized there was a body hidden under all these plants. The police had set up a guard at the fortune teller's place, but a crowd of neighbors still gathered there. The police searched the room and found the body of a man under the petals, a flower seller from the alley. The police chief reported to the Duke. The flower seller had helped the fortune teller attract customers by talking about some kind of miracle cure. Kalen began to formulate a new plan now that he knew the culprit had an accomplice. The man was thinking hard. He had heard a story before about a flower seller in that alley. The chief said they didn't know who sent the flowers, as there were far too many, much more than needed to hide a body. Kalen grabbed the chief as he suddenly understood. The police's witness was a child living in the alley, an orphan who played with Laia. But the chief's answer stunned the Duke. He said the children often shared leftover flowers with each other. Kalen rushed to the door, realizing that Laia getting the flower was more than just a coincidence. The man was racing towards the carriage, heading to the hospital to see the girl. He knew that boy's death was more than just an accident. Kalen jumped into the carriage and yelled at the butler to keep up. The man was terrified, his mind consumed with ensuring the little girl's safety. Laia's thoughts were a mess, mostly about how the Duke felt about her now. A rush of footsteps echoed from the hallway as Kalen charged towards Laia's room. The door was thrown open, startling the little girl on the bed. Before the people could rush in, Laia managed to hide behind the headboard. Kalen and Shane burst into the room, panting and looking around frantically, finding nothing. The men leaned against the wall, still trying to recover. The Duke walked straight towards Laia, who was now frozen in fear, completely convinced he was going to get rid of her. The Duke's hand almost touched her face, and Laia squeezed her eyes shut, ready for anything. But Kalen gripped her shoulders tightly, knelt down, and pulled her into a tight embrace. Leia didn't know how to react, but her heart stopped when the Duke said he was her dad and that he was with her now. The man let go of Leia and began to apologize for not being there due to an urgent matter, but now he would spend time with her because he had been so worried about her. His words moved Leia, and she clutched the hem of her pajamas emotionally. No one had ever cared for her when she was sick before. She remembered suffering alone during hard times when hunger was everywhere, and even with friends, she could only rely on herself. Leia looked at the Duke, her heart pounding, and she finally understood what it felt like to be cared for. But she immediately pushed these pleasant thoughts from her mind, because now the Duke could make any decision he wanted about her life in the house. Resigned to her fate, Leia began to talk about her late-night escape, but Kaelin interrupted her. The man fumbled in his pocket, making Leia watch his movements. He held out his palm, on which lay the red flower, and asked her if she had seen such a plant elsewhere. The girl touched the flower, reminding him that she had given him that plant and that she knew nothing about it. Kaelin believed her and took the cursed flower from her hand. The Duke calmed down, but Leia still saw a shadow of doubt on his face, despite his silence. Kaelin reached out to her, thanking her for saving him, but he felt ashamed because as a father, he should be the one taking care of his daughter, not the other way around. He stroked Leia's hair firmly, telling her she should never do that again, not for him or for anyone. The girl tried to argue, but eventually agreed with the Duke, while Shane stood by, watching the reunion happily. Kaelin had missed the little one and kept stroking her hair, and Leia enjoyed the attention. The girl relaxed so much that Kaelin started to worry about her health, beginning to check on her and threatening that the doctors were quacks who would be punished if they hadn't cured her. Hearing the Duke's angry words, a doctor in the next room felt a chill. Kaelin didn't understand why his daughter didn't press him about everything she saw at the fortune tellers. But Leia only knew that the Duke had disposed of a truly bad person. The girl knew Kaelin wouldn't touch anyone who hadn't committed a truly unforgivable crime. That was his golden rule, so she didn't ask questions. There was silence in the room. Her innocence surprised him. She wasn't so scared that she screamed and ran away. Kaelin decided to probe a little. He needed to know why Leia had insisted that Jude go to the fortune teller's house. In the dead of night, Leia remained silent. The Duke hinted he was just curious, and Leia then admitted she had seen the pages of the report on her bedroom floor. Because that night, the Duke, who had promised to stay with her, had indeed forgotten a report in her room, a report containing important intelligence about a killer. The man pondered the fact that he had forgotten the report that night. This act had alerted Leia, as Cullen was always meticulous. Standing by, Cheyenne couldn't help but ask Leia if she could actually read. Leia confessed that when she was on the streets, she had memorized the look of all the signs, so she knew the fortune teller's house because there were rumors in the alley that the sinister prophet was kidnapping children. But that night, Leia noticed the handwriting on the document was similar to that on the signs and the report, so she deduced that the fortune teller's house was the crime scene. These clues helped Leia find a direction for her search, so she woke Jade that night, and they went to save Cullen together. The Duke found it hard to believe, even though she sounded sincere. But the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like a miracle. Cullen nervously tapped his fingers on his leg, mulling over how his daughter had demonstrated her abilities, drawn conclusions, and even used his report. Although he now had more questions than before, the man tried to remain calm. But he decided to end the interrogation and asked Leia not to do anything so reckless again. Cullen promised that from now on, he would always listen to the girl's opinions, as she was not only intelligent, but also quite perceptive for her age. Leia hadn't expected the man to come to these conclusions about her, but decided not to mention her memories of the book. She looked again at the red flower, which raised many questions for her, as it made the Duke anxious again, just as it had on her first day at the manor. Leia decided she had to find out why this flower caused the Duke so much inner turmoil. The butler was surprised that the girl could ask such a profound question. His gaze made Leia look away, regretting her curiosity. The Duke decided to be honest, and he confessed that the red flowers were left by a true masterpiece. But even with all these clues, the guys still didn't know who this eccentric was. So Leia was terrified by his words. Cullen explained that at every crime scene, the red flower was deliberately sent to give a hint he couldn't decipher. Even with all these clues, the killer was still running rampant in the capital, knowing the Duke knew nothing about him. These details utterly shocked the child, and her heart pounded wildly with fear. But she realized her adoption was now up in the air, because Cullen had hoped she could solve this mystery, and now the sincerity of the Duke's care for her had become questionable. The child was on the verge of tears, not knowing what to do, as she had already grown deeply attached to the Duke and Jade. There wasn't a chapter in the book about this, so the girl had no idea what to do now. The man noticed the change in her behavior, and he admitted that she was very intelligent for her age. Cullen caressed Leah's cheek, recalling how he had once suspected her of being a spy. But after everything she had done for the Leveton family, he now saw her differently. Leah couldn't trust his sincerity so quickly, but the man insisted that she was now his savior, even if she was still a suspicious child. But the man was happy they had such a wonderful father-daughter relationship, and this confession caught Leah off guard. Cullen promised that everything would be all right for them. Now, the Duke knelt beside the girl, explaining that his job was to deal with the real bad guys that the police couldn't touch. Leah listened intently, even though the information he was sharing was top secret. Cullen hinted that only members of the Leveton family should know about his affairs, but since Leah was also family, he could let her in on it. Leah's calm acceptance of such dangerous information surprised the man, who couldn't figure out why she was so composed. Leah declared she would take these family secrets to her grave, and no one would ever pry the information from her. The man sighed, exhausted by these conversations, but he still wanted to know more. The girl tensed up, because at times like this, you couldn't predict what the Duke would do. The only thing Cullen cared about was why she called him Duke. He moved closer again, asking her to call him by the proper title. Leah felt very awkward. Cullen stared at her, waiting for an answer, but every word from her grated on his ears. He reminded her that she had called him by the proper title before. So, after a moment's thought, the girl called him Dad. When Cullen asked her to call him that from now on, Leah's face turned bright red with embarrassment. The Duke had Jade brought in. He had fallen asleep in the next room after staying up late watching over Leah. The man took the little girl in his arms, ready to return to the manor. Leah wrapped her arms around his neck, happy that all the bad things were over. The Duke's carriage was decorated with balloons, and Leah's joy reached its peak, and she couldn't help but scream. Jade had thrown a party for Leah, surrounding her with a ton of her favorite balloons. The Duke watched intently as Leah's happiness grew by the second. Suddenly, the man asked if they should stop at the toy store, but his words unsettled the girl. Cullen mentioned that the last time, Leah had been staring at the toy store window, looking super cute. To Leah, that felt like a long time ago, because she wouldn't have even found the store if it weren't for that lost balloon. She remembered how parents would often take their children to such stores during festivals. She always watched from a corner, because the world she lived in was completely different from the world of those children. She imagined what it would be like if she and the Duke could go to that store like other parents. The man promised they could go to the store anytime, as he had just bought the entire place. A loud gasp was heard in the carriage, as Leah had absolutely not expected the Duke to say something like that. She looked at the guys, begging Cheyenne to reassure her the Duke wouldn't do such a thing, but the butler regretfully admitted he couldn't stop Cullen. Cheyenne accidentally let it slip that the Duke was so stressed about picking the perfect welcome home gift for her that he had completely lost his mind. She was embarrassed that he had bought the whole store, but the guy turned to the window, somewhat sheepishly, and admitted he had only paid a deposit for the store. Cullen nonchalantly said that he had only ever bought a gift for a child once, and that time he bought a gift for Jade was because Maryanne had convinced him. At the time, the guy had picked out a teddy bear in a soldier's uniform. But when Cullen gave him the gift, little Jade declared he only wanted a rational father-son relationship, so ordinary gifts wouldn't move him. Jade chimed in that from now on, they would give each other peace of mind for their birthdays instead of awkward moments like this, since Cheyenne always bought the gifts anyway. The butler was annoyed at being exposed, but Jade had long known his dad would never give a tasteless gift like a toy or a book. The father and son began to bicker, as Cullen had tolerated many of his son's strange behaviors, even giving him a snake. Leah watched them, feeling sad that her family's relationship was so cold, as Jade still hadn't received a birthday gift directly from the Duke. Cheyenne whispered that the Duke was inexperienced in picking gifts and other thoughtful gestures. Cullen kept complaining that the taxidermy animal he gave was just like any stuffed toy from a store. Leah looked at her dad, guessing he hadn't been a spoiled child who received gifts from his family. The little one tugged on the man's jacket and promised that if he had nightmares, the teddy bear could always chase away bad thoughts. Leah giggled and sternly announced that with habits like these, they needed to set some new rules. The girl proudly raised her head, demanding that from now on, when they were scared, they should come to her room and hug her until the Duke got his teddy bear. But her words sounded ridiculous, so everyone in the carriage turned to look at her. The Duke couldn't help himself and started stroking Leah's hair again. Cullen looked at her and assured her that he could just eat her up because of his strong feelings for her. But the girl didn't appreciate his offer. Cheyenne clarified what the young lady had wanted from the toy store during her convalescence at the manor. Leah requested that the store be returned to its owner, but Cullen promised to give her the store when she grew up. The little one asked the Duke to just buy her a single doll that he had picked out himself, instead of buying the whole damn store. The man paused and asked her to repeat herself. She said she would be happy with any doll he chose, but her words only made him smile smugly. He hated that she kept calling him Duke, but he still kissed her forehead and promised to buy her any doll she wanted. Leah touched her head and smiled. As the carriage neared the manor gates, Leah requested that the toy store refund the full deposit to the Duke. It was late, and Leah was lying listlessly on the bed in her room. After returning to the manor, Cheyenne had told her to stay in bed until the therapist and the priest arrived. Leah sat up. Thanks to the priest's magic, she no longer felt any pain, but she was still scared by how close she had come to dying. She decided to walk around a bit, as she was tired of sitting. She slowly rushed towards the open balcony doors, but collapsed to the floor after just a few steps, gasping for air. Her body was still very weak. Moonlight streamed in through the window, and Leah noticed it, captivated by the moon's beauty. Leah bathed in the moonlight, remembering it was now the moon festival, and the moon was at its fullest. She worried that now, without knowing what would happen next in the book, she would become useless. Leah couldn't shake the fact that even Cullen himself understood how dangerous the killer with the red flowers was. The book described how Cullen had successfully handled that incident, but now Leah had a bad feeling about the man of flowers. But in the chapter about the red-haired fortune teller, one detail stood out. The criminal used a special poison, colorless and odorless, but it wasn't something an ordinary person could get their hands on. Leah slowly got to her feet, trying to piece the facts together into a new clue. Opening the window, she wondered if Cullen was thinking the same thing she was. She remembered his request for her to call him Dad. Leah had long since stopped thinking about family, but sometimes she dreamed of having someone she could call that. But living alone on the streets, she often pushed those thoughts out of her mind. However, she now had people who had pulled her out of her loneliness. She had Jade, Cheyenne, and Dad by her side. But with so many good things happening, she was afraid something bad would follow. Leah thought that when she started calling the Duke Dad, she was reaching out her hand to him, but maybe one day he would no longer need her. The little one shook her head, trying to get rid of these bad thoughts. The little one bowed her head in prayer, deciding to ask the moon for a little help. Leah quietly prayed to the moon to help her stay in this house for a long time. In another manner, a nobleman stood on his balcony looking at the moon when one of his servants reported that he had already dealt with the florist, deliberately leaving the guy's body in a conspicuous place. The nobleman smiled smugly, deciding they needed to be more careful in choosing the criminals who helped them achieve their goals. The servant looked at his master, who hinted that under the moonlight, everyone is equal. The master sat down, promising to help anyone who needed his guidance, as he was an expert planner. The nobleman was curious about the Cullen family's adopted daughter, and the servant presented his report. The man mused that the girl was too young for flowers, but he had already set things in motion. The nobleman chuckled, now wondering what role this girl would play in the Duke's household. In the moonlight, a flower tattoo on the man's hand flashed. He was now waiting to meet Leah. Morning came, and Leah moved drowsily in her bed until her face bumped into something soft. The girl opened one eye, trying to figure out what was next to her. She shot up in bed, excitedly holding up a plush teddy bear, completely losing her composure. The little one started hugging the toy, thrilled by its softness. Just as Leah was examining the bear's multicolored eyes, a black envelope fell beside her. Picking up the letter, Leah was surprised by the discovery and assumed it was from the Duke. She decided to ask Cheyenne to help her decipher this important letter. The butler was chatting with the staff when suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the hallway. The adults turned towards the shout that rang through the house. Leah ran towards the butler, waving the black envelope as she went. The girl showed Cheyenne the bear, but the man was more worried that running like that might aggravate her wounds. The girl spun the bear around. Cheyenne smiled at her and hinted that it was probably a gift from the Duke, as such a toy would take a long time to make. Leah handed the man the envelope, asking him to read everything written inside. The butler opened the letter, and his face fell as he realized its contents. The guy confirmed that Cullen had indeed given her the stuffed animal he always kept in his office. Cheyenne handed the envelope back to Leah and told her to go to the Duke and ask him to read the card himself. The guy said the letter mentioned Leah's new name, so he insisted she go to the Duke to get the information firsthand. Leah started to freak out about how long a noble's name could be, not wanting to lose a part of herself in the process. Just then, a faint rustle was heard behind the butler. The Duke told Cheyenne to read the letter, his ninja-like appearance startling everyone in the hallway. Cullen was enjoying the whole situation, urging the butler to hurry up and read the damn letter. Cheyenne was very uncomfortable, but he picked up the envelope and card again. The guy began to read the words on the paper in a monotone voice, saying that Leah should think of a new name for the toy. The Duke smiled and told Cheyenne to read with a little more feeling. The butler grabbed the toy, waved it around, and cheerfully announced that it wasn't just the teddy bear getting a new name. From now on, Leah's name was Leticia, meaning the sky covered by 1,000 moons. Leah stroked the teddy bear as Cheyenne finished reading the letter. The letter promised that the bear would protect her from any nightmares and that its jewel-like eyes would forever light her path. The little girl hugged the toy tightly. Her old name had only meant born on a Monday, but the Duke had kept a part of her old name in the new one, so she could still carry some memory of her past life and her mother. Cullen looked at his daughter, ecstatic that out of the thousands of children born on a Monday, he had gotten the one who was comparable to 1,000 bright moons in the sky. The little one was shy, but she thanked Cheyenne for reading the letter. Cullen decided to tease Cheyenne a bit, complimenting his reading as well, though the butler was embarrassed by his little performance. The Duke knelt beside Leah, worried about whether she liked her new name. He admitted he had struggled a lot with choosing a name because their meeting felt like a wild dream. But the man wanted to make the little girl even happier, so he suggested they start celebrating her birthday right now. I mean, the day you get a new name is a big deal. The Duke gave Leah a happy smile and wished her a happy birthday because she was now his most precious daughter. His words made Leah blush, her cheeks turning bright red. But then she suddenly jumped on the Duke, giving him the tightest hug ever. The man was taken aback, but since Leah had entered his life, he felt better with each passing day. While Cullen was still sitting on the floor in complete astonishment, Leah, holding her bear, decided to run and tell Jade everything. The Duke watched the girl leave, still reeling from the shock of her hug. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the hallway again as Leah ran to find Jade. The guy was sleeping when a loud shout of his name came from nearby. Leah jumped on his bed, shouting her new name. She showed the guy the toy and the letter, shouting that her father had now named her Leticia and that they were celebrating her birthday today. Jade liked the name, but apologized for not having a gift ready, as he didn't know about the celebration. The guy noticed the bear's eyes were beautiful jewels, and his comment worried Leah. Jade reached out and took the teddy bear. He pointed to the toy's eyes, where a ruby and a sapphire were sparkling. Leah dropped the envelope in surprise, and the room fell silent. But she finally realized what the gems were. An even louder scream was heard. The gems on the stuffed toy's face glittered in the light as Leah began a serious conversation. The family was having breakfast, but Leah wasn't touching her food and hinted to the man that if he kept giving such expensive gifts, he might spoil her. The man laughed, talking about his plans to raise the girl so lavishly that no other nobleman could compare. Leah was horrified by his words, as that could make everyone hate her. Cullen teased her, joking that it was all part of his grand plan, so she would never leave the duchy and would always be his daughter. The little one didn't understand how it all connected, because she could be his daughter even without the jewels. Jade found it amusing to watch Leah and their dad bond over expensive gifts. Suddenly, Leah spotted a stunningly beautiful white cake covered in strawberries. Cheyenne placed the dessert on the table, proudly saying the Duke had made it for her himself. All of a sudden, the entire staff of the manor crowded around the dining table. The staff cheered in unison, congratulating the young lady on her first birthday with the Leveton family. They were genuinely happy for the child. Leah was caught off guard and didn't know how to react. Not wanting to be left out, Jade and Cheyenne also jumped in to wish the little one a happy birthday. Cullen grinned, immensely proud that his daughter was turning 10 today. Leah was stunned. She had never experienced anything like this and was completely speechless. But the next moment, her heart pounded, and she gave everyone around her a sweet smile. Cheyenne cut a small piece of cake, while Maid prepared tea for the girl celebrating her first birthday. She was ecstatic. The Duke and Jade watched her, their home celebrating the arrival of a new family member, Leticia. Leah ate a piece of cake and decided she would remember this day forever. But she hadn't forgotten the book. After receiving the teddy bear, she recalled a side story from the novel where, before Christmas, a group of children gathered in front of a toy store window. Inside, Duke Cullen was picking a gift for Jade and decided on a bear in a military uniform. Cheyenne assured the man that Jade would love the gift his father had chosen for him. Cullen walked out of the store, and his presence scattered the children on the street. The children scurried to a corner after Cheyenne told the boss they were just some local poor kids startled by the owner's appearance. Cullen relaxed after realizing they hadn't run away because of him. The owner sometimes suspected the orphans of stealing and would shoo them away from the displays. The orphans peeked out from the corner, waiting for the owner to go back behind the counter. Leah was among that group of children, even younger than when she first met the Leveton family. The Duke looked at her carefully, but couldn't figure out why she caught his attention. Cullen handed Cheyenne a gold coin and told him to give the money to the owner, asking him to keep the window lights on tonight. Cheyenne didn't understand the request, but as Cullen climbed into the carriage, he admitted he didn't want to ruin the other children's holiday, and his gift wouldn't make Jade happy anyway. This behavior was out of character for the boss, and the butler was surprised. Late at night, with a blizzard raging outside, little Leah stood in front of the store window, looking at the toys. Even living on the edge, she could still find joy in the little things. A month had passed since Leah's birthday at the Leveton Manor. The case of the red-haired fortune teller was closed, but Leah spent all her free time in the manor. Her injuries were healing well, but she wasn't allowed to go out, so she spent a lot of time learning to read. Sometimes Maryanne would visit, filling Leah's wardrobe with new clothes from all the trendiest shops. Over time, Leah's health improved greatly, and the little one had even gained some weight. They were sewing new dresses for her, and according to the maids, it had started to snow outside the manor walls. Every time Maryanne visited, she was captivated by Leigh's stunning beauty. She couldn't believe how quickly time had passed, and that Leigh was no longer the shy little girl who had first stepped through the manor's gates. Leigh told her about the upcoming boat trip. Maryanne continued the conversation while styling Leigh's hair. She was worried about Leigh's upcoming trip, even though Jade had promised to take good care of the girl during the journey. Maryanne finished styling her hair and let Leigh look in the mirror to see how beautiful she was. The lady remarked that it was a wonderful thing to watch the little one grow up in the family, but she was even more eager to see what kind of woman she would become. Leigh looked at Maryanne, having recently learned that the lady couldn't marry due to her status as a saintess, and thought that was probably why she looked so sad. Leigh tried to cheer her up, promising that she would become as wonderful as Maryanne when she grew up. The lady was surprised, but Leigh confessed that Maryanne was a person with a pure soul, and she wanted to become as radiant as her. Maryanne began to hug Leigh, but told her not to pick up any of her bad habits. Jade appeared in the room, already prepared for the boat outing. The lady laughingly told Jade to learn from her how to properly appreciate wine, but her advice only embarrassed the boy. Leigh stopped laughing and asked Maryanne if she would like to join them on the boat trip. The lady kissed Leigh's cheek, but declined, as she had to attend a celebration at the temple. The lady saw the children to the porch, and they walked toward the boat together. Leigh excitedly grabbed Jade's hand, but she had no idea what this picnic would turn into. The white boat cut through the water, the sunlight glinting on the waves. Lei had never seen such a beautiful sight and couldn't hide her amazement. She wished Cullen could be here too, but he had to attend a political meeting that he couldn't miss. Lei remembered how disappointed the Duke had looked when he had to give up the family picnic. Suddenly, they heard someone shouting from nearby, asking if the children were going to Lenox Island. Jade turned and saw 3 teenagers on a nearby boat, waving their arms frantically. He recognized them, but was annoyed that they were going to the same place. The guys were waving their arms so exaggeratedly, so much so that their boat began to rock violently. Lei asked Jade who the teenagers were. Jade just said dismissively that they were just a few academy seniors he had met at a birthday party. The boat carrying the teenagers had tried to catch up with the Leveton's boat, but the captain skillfully changed course. Lei felt uneasy about the strangers, but she was more concerned about why Jade didn't go to the academy every day. Jade agreed with her, saying that attendance scores were very important, but his words surprised Lei as she realized Jade was breaking the academy's rules. Jade recalled how he had passed the exam with an unprecedentedly high score, which greatly shocked the teachers, so he was now basically exempt from school obligations. Jade declared that since their family were pure-blood mages, self-study was enough for him, and he spent the rest of his time with Lei, which in a way made her an accomplice to his truancy. Lei fantasized about eventually entering the academy herself, where the tuition must cost a fortune. The girl giggled, as Jade had just revealed how to exploit loopholes in the academy system, giving her some very bad ideas. Jade reminded her that one must always follow the rules, especially when it comes to knowing when to be flexible and when to be firm. So Lei should start by learning all the letters. Jade promised her that once she learned to read, all the knowledge of the Empire would be open to her. Lei also mentioned that she had already learned to write her family's names, so soon she would be able to exchange letters just like those noble aristocratic families. Lei smiled again and promised that she would write her first letter to Jade. Lei's bright smile was infectious, and Jade couldn't help but smile along with her. The girl warned him not to even think about making fun of her. Suddenly, Jade asked Lei if there was anyone she particularly wanted to see. The little one paused for a moment, but immediately thought of Walter, a friend with whom she had spent a lot of time in the back alleys of the capital. The memory made Lei sad. She and Walter used to always support each other, but now she lived a completely different life. But she assured Jade that she and the other orphans had made a promise. If they happened to meet on the streets, they would pretend not to know each other. Jade was confused, so Lei explained that they had made this rule a long time ago because the streets were dangerous and they couldn't put others in danger. And the promise also said that even if someone went to a better place, the others shouldn't go looking for them. These thoughts made Lei hug her teddy bear tighter and grow even sadder. She remembered how when she was on the streets, she and the other children tried to be fair, always dividing food into equal portions. Street fights among the orphans were common, but they always remembered to stick together, so quarrels were quickly forgotten. Lei pushed her past aside and smiled at Jade, thanking the Leveton family for saving her from the streets and for not having to rely on a tattered blanket for warmth this winter. Jade realized that Lei had lied when they first met, when she said the back alleys were actually warm. The girl realized she had let it slip, but decided to stick to her story, claiming that only one winter had been a bit tough. Jade looked at Lei scrutinizingly, making her tremble all over. After calming down, Jade told Lei to stop dwelling on the past, because now she had a new home. The little one blushed, thinking that the more Cullen gave her, the more grateful she should be. The boy smiled and promised that he would always be grateful to her. Jade also leaned in closer and sincerely thanked Lei for coming to their home that day, for overcoming her illness, and for being able to go on a boat trip with him. Lei's cheeks turned pink, and she felt a warm flutter in her heart. She couldn't help but hug him, calling him brother for the first time, just as Lei was thinking about learning to write as soon as possible so she could pour all her feelings onto a card and relive this happy memory forever. The boat docked. The children got off the boat and began to walk along the shore of Lenox Island. Lei spotted some wonderful bushes full of vibrant flowers, and she grabbed Jade's hand, dragging him forward. The boy told her to calm down, as she had just recovered from her illness and shouldn't overexert herself, and they had the whole day to play. Lei walked over to a bush full of blue roses and took a deep breath. The fragrance was incredible. Jade explained that blue roses only bloom once a year for a few days, so they had specifically chosen to come to the island when the flowers were at their peak and no one else was around. The girl looked around. They were the only two on the island, so Jade's plan for some peace and quiet was going perfectly. Jade sniffed a flower and then said something about the bad rumors surrounding these flowers, making Lane nervous. The boy touched a flower and said that the toxins in the blue roses would drive people mad, and anyone who came to the island on the day they bloomed would meet their end. Lay was terrified by the horror stories Jade was telling. Jade swore to her that all the terrible things about Lennox Island were just local superstitions. Lay thought the stories were like those urban legends about dying if you sleep with the fan on. The little one touched the flower. She loved the color, but felt sad that the plant had such a bad reputation. Jade suddenly said that they had once found 2 bodies on the island, people who had died suddenly. The boy pointed to some bushes, but Lay was so scared she hid behind him. Jade found her reaction amusing and started pointing to the bushes where the dead bodies were found again. After hearing that horrible story, Lay's face turned pale, and she didn't ask Jade about the flowers again. The boy decided to let the girl off the hook, telling her that the flowers had only temporarily changed color because magic stones were buried in their roots. But for a long time, people didn't know about the magic stones, so rumors spread that the extremely rare colored roses were poisonous and would drive people mad, even though they were just ordinary flowers. A servant appeared on the lawn and called the children to the shore for lunch, where a picnic was already set up. But when they reached the shore, they were met by the teenagers from the other boat. They were very excited to see Jade, as he hadn't been to the academy in a long time. Jade was not happy about their visit, so he said coldly that he just wanted to be alone with his sister. Lay stood behind Jade, and when the teenagers heard about his sister, they tried to get a look at her. The teenagers were too loud, so Lay felt she was still too nervous to interact with this group of young nobles. The girl shyly peeked out from behind her brother, but didn't dare to step forward. Suddenly, Jade took a sharp step back, pressing himself closer to the girl. He said firmly that it was time to go their separate ways. An upperclassman walked up to Jade, patted him on the shoulder, and said with a smirk that one must always introduce oneself to the young ladies. Jade was not pleased, but he stepped aside and introduced Lay as his sister. The little girl looked completely overwhelmed, but she still curtsied and said softly that her name was Leticia. Her small gesture made the upperclassmen clutch their chests, completely charmed by her adorable behavior. The guys started whispering, saying they had no idea the ducal family had such a cute child. An upper-class boy approached her politely and introduced himself as Lion. Leticia found Lion's face familiar, but she couldn't remember where she had seen him before. Another student appeared before Leticia, bowed, and introduced himself as Percy. Percy was captivated by the little girl's politeness and couldn't hide how impressed he was. Suddenly, a guy named Jax knelt on one knee beside Leticia, took her hand, and gushed about how she looked like a fairy. The guy leaned in, about to press a kiss on the young lady's hand. But in an instant, her hand was gone from his grasp. Jade had scooped Lay up into his arms and pulled her away, making sure Jax couldn't touch the little girl. He said that Lay was shy around strangers, and then gave Jax a look that could kill, making him tremble in fear. The other kids tried to smooth things over, but Jade assured them that if they dared to lay a finger on his sister, they would be in big trouble. The little girl was happy that her brother was protecting her, but she knew him well enough to know that his threats were no joke. Desserts were laid out on the picnic blanket, and tea time continued. The maid and her assistant said goodbye to the nobles and headed for the pier. The little girl happily munched on her sandwich, as it was specially made with her favorite things. Jade poured some tea for Lay, glad that after so long, he and Lay could finally have a walk together, even with some uninvited guests. He waved dismissively at the guests, telling them to hurry up, finish their tea, and get lost. Percy tried to play pitiful to gain Jade's sympathy, but he knew they had only skipped class to prove how tough they were. Jax laughed at Percy because they hadn't wanted to come to the island due to the rumors of the Blue Rose curse. But Lion had been very excited about the trip. Lay had been watching Lion closely. She was sure she knew him and hadn't seen him among the nobility before. Lion chatted with the others, smiling at Lay from time to time. Suddenly, Lion wanted to tell a funny story about Jade, about the time the whole class got detention and the guys slept through the entire period. Lay found the classmates' story amusing, but Jade threatened them to shut up again. The guys suggested Jade give Lei a tour of the academy, but he just sneered, saying that Lei would surely attract some clingy pests there. Lei kept laughing at the teenager's silly antics and realized her suspicions about Lion were unfounded, as he was very friendly. Percy suddenly declared that Lion was one of the best students at the academy, which made the guy blush profusely. Percy said Lion used to be very shy, but over time his personality had completely changed, and now he was very outgoing. Lion smiled and thanked his friends for their constant support. Percy got very excited about the idea of hosting Miss Lei's debutante ball at his own manner. Lei felt embarrassed, but Jade stepped in to protect her from these foolish suggestions, announcing that he and the Duke would decide which ball Lei would attend first. Lei was surprised, but the boy promised that when she grew up, she could go wherever she wanted without needing his or her father's permission. The little one liked this plan, and she hugged her bear, revealing a sweet smile. Percy clutched his chest, once again deeply moved by her charm. But Jade decided to put a stop to it, warning Percy not to have any improper thoughts about his sister's appearance. The guys were intimidated by Jade, but Jax noticed that Jade acted differently around Lei, his face no longer looking so cold. Lei watched Jade and the teenagers bicker about proper conduct within the family and laughed again. Lion stood up, deciding to go to the blue rose bushes to pick a small bouquet for his sister. Percy and Jax suddenly became sullen, and Lei couldn't understand why Lion sounded so sad when he mentioned his sister. Percy asked Lion if he needed him to come along. Lion sneered and admitted that he didn't believe the rumors about the blue roses, so he would handle it himself. The guys cheered for Lion, saying they didn't believe the rumors either, but as soon as he disappeared into the bushes, their faces fell. The little one tried to figure out if the teenagers were really okay. Jax put on a happy face, but Percy's expression clearly showed there was a secret between them. After Lion had walked a distance and started picking flowers, Jax confessed that his friend's sister had passed away, so he just wanted to pick a bouquet for her grave. Jax remembered Lion's sister, who had long hair and was considered incredibly beautiful by everyone. The guy mentioned that Percy had been engaged to the girl. That was why Lion had been friends with them for so long. Percy's face was filled with sadness as he said softly that Elise lived in the village, so they couldn't see each other often. Lei was touched by the story, because in her past life, she too had fought a long battle with illness all alone. Jax's expression grew even sadder, and tears began to well up in his eyes. But when the guy said that Elise had died of pneumonia, Lei was horrified. Lion emerged from behind the trees with a bouquet of blue roses. Lei felt embarrassed, realizing that Lion had heard the entire conversation while he was away. Lion lowered his head and admitted that he had invited them to the island because his sister had always dreamed of seeing the blue roses. The guy adjusted his hat and said he was glad his friends could come, but he didn't want to bring everyone down with sad topics. He remembered finding a box among his sister's things the day before. Elise loved the color blue, so she had filled the box with many blue items. Lion looked at Percy and thanked him for still mourning Elise and for not looking for a new fiancée. Percy was grateful for his friend's words. Despite his family's wealth, Elise meant more to him than anything and held a special place in his heart. Lion clutched the bouquet tighter, saying he was grateful that Percy's family hadn't demanded the return of the jewelry after the engagement was called off, which had allowed Lion's family to restore its noble status. The teenagers fell into an awkward silence, and Jax felt very uncomfortable. Suddenly, one of the guys blurted out that they should all go visit Elise. Lion's mood brightened, and he thought his sister would surely appreciate the gesture if Percy brought her flowers. Lei watched the guys from the side, moved by their deep friendship. Lion wiped away his tears, changed the subject, and asked Lei if she liked city life. The guy recalled his first time coming to the capital from the countryside, and even after all these years, he was still discovering amazing places in the city. Years ago, Lion was a very shy guy, so when he got off the train, he was completely terrified. He remembered the bells ringing from the blue clock tower, sending birds scattering across the sky. Lion enjoyed the memories of the past, but his youth was gone, and now new memories were waiting for him. Lei liked his story, even though the alley she had lived in wasn't as beautiful as the blue clock tower. Jade and Lei slipped away to the other side of the island, needing some peace and quiet from the teenagers. Lei had enjoyed the trip and said she would love to come back to the island another day. Jade was glad his sister had enjoyed their little outing. The little one started to yawn. After such a long day, she was exhausted and needed to sleep. Suddenly, Lei was startled, worried that Jade would leave her behind if she fell asleep. She begged him not to forget to wake her up when it was time to go back. Jade stared at her, but Lei was completely lost in her own thoughts, thinking about what would happen if she and Jade got separated, like if she would end up back on the streets. The guy snatched her hat and playfully covered her face with it. She looked at him in surprise, and he promised he wouldn't leave her there alone. Lei clutched the hat in her hands, her mood instantly brightening. A while later, Lei opened her eyes and stared at the dazzling sun. She woke with a start, looking around in a daze. How long had she been asleep? On a patch of grass nearby, Percy glanced toward the shore, where he could hear the laughter of girls. A boat was slowly approaching the island, and Cullen stood there, surrounded by a group of young women. Lei jumped up excitedly and called out to the Duke upon seeing him, waving toward where she and Jade were. The Duke jumped off the boat, thanking the girls for the pleasant company, while Lei was already running toward him from the other side of the beach, her face all smiles. Cullen waved goodbye to the girls, even as they kept shouting invitations for him to attend balls at their manors. The man swept Lei into his arms, wondering how his children had been spending their time together. Lei didn't believe the Duke had missed them. He had been having too much fun chatting with the girls who had kindly given him a ride. Cullen playfully pinched Lei's cheek, promising that for her, he would run to the ends of the earth. The teenagers, who had been having a great time at the picnic, suddenly froze in fear when they saw the Duke. Cullen was still holding Lei, but his gaze, full of arrogance, swept over the teenagers. Lei jumped down from the man's arms, and he called Jade over. The Duke wanted to know why these strange guys were surrounding his little daughter without a guardian, but his icy voice made the guys even more afraid. Cullen looked at the alcohol with disgust, his menacing gaze scaring the teenagers into hiccuping. Jax scrambled to hide the bottles, while Percy and Lion jumped up, almost standing at attention as they swore they hadn't bothered the young lady all day. The Duke kept staring at the guys, demanding to know who they were. The guys were incoherent, with Percy trying to introduce himself first. Suddenly, the teenagers started arguing about what to tell the Duke, but Jade appeared beside Cullen and assured him that they had just run into some students from the academy. The man relaxed when he realized these teenagers weren't parasites disturbing his children's vacation. Jade enjoyed his father's joke and agreed that now was not the time to deal with these students. The kids completely missed the Duke's humor. They were pale with fear, although Lei found the whole thing very amusing. The Duke decided to take pity on the students, smiling and promising not to cause them any trouble, as he was just worried about his daughter. The kids settled back down on the blanket, ready to continue eating, but Jade wanted to know how his father had gotten out of the political meeting so early. Cullen sat down next to his son. His meeting had ended early because the king hadn't been very focused lately. The Duke glanced at the students, who were sitting quietly, though he asked them what they had been talking about with his children just now. Jax mustered up the courage to admit that they were just telling the young lady about life in the capital. Lei leaned closer to the Duke, as he couldn't help but ask the students to say what was bothering them, as they looked both scared and excited. Percy had been upset ever since Cullen appeared, so he stood up and decided to take a walk around the island by himself. Percy headed toward the edge of the woods, while Jax started pestering the Duke about the magic business and Cullen's time as student council president. Lei watched Percy leave, worried because he looked so troubled. Cullen distracted the girl, and she agreed to listen to some details. Speaking of the man's life, Cullen let out a soft laugh and finally agreed to provide some information for the student's paper. But before the Duke could begin his story, a sudden gust of strong wind blew, making the little one shiver from a cold. Jade took off his coat and draped it over Lei's shoulders. Lion took out a small mirror, saying he would run to the riverbank to signal the servants to come over, to pick them up from the island. Suddenly, Lei glanced to the side as she heard the sound of a stone falling into the river from somewhere behind the trees. Lion emerged from the bushes and, smiling, explained to the little girl that there were many diving ducks on Lennox Island, and they made a loud splash when they dove underwater. Lion assured them that the servants had received his signal and would be on the island soon. Although they still didn't know where Percy had wandered off to, everyone was discussing where Percy might have gone, especially if he had had a bit too much to drink. Lei suggested to the Duke that they take a walk to the blue rose bushes before they left the island by boat. The girl took the man's hand and led him towards the hill full of flowers, eager for him to see the beautiful scenery. Cullen was intrigued. He genuinely enjoyed being with the children. Lei was too focused to notice for a moment. Cullen's expression grew tense. The Duke and Jade were staring grimly at the other side of the hill, but Lee didn't understand why. The little girl turned her head towards the bushes, trying to figure out what was happening. But suddenly, Jade grabbed her and pulled her close, telling Lee not to look at the hill. However, with just a quick glance, Lee saw what was on the hill. Among the blue rose bushes lay Percy's lifeless body, his arms covered in cuts. The girl tried to break free from Jade's grip, but he was stronger than her and held her tightly. He asked the Duke for his opinion on Percy's death. The Duke approached the bushes, examined Percy's body, and saw a small knife. However, he doubted the fellow could have done this to himself. A smug smile appeared on the Duke's face, as the trip had just become much more interesting. Lee couldn't break free from Jade's grip, but Cullen's aura set off alarm bells in her mind. The man ordered Lee to step back a bit, and a few seconds later, she screamed for help from the other young men. The girl was terrified. Her father and brother were going to check the body, while she had to distract the other kids. Jade went to his father's side, while Lee sprinted towards the riverbank. The screams were so loud that the young men, who were packing up, were startled by Lee's sudden appearance. When the boys ran up to her, Lee waved towards the hill, but she was speechless, unable to explain what had happened. Jax and Lion looked in the direction Lee was gesturing. Then, their hearts stopped at the chaotic scene before them. When they found Percy's body in the bushes, the boys were rendered speechless. The young men were trying to process it all, but the Duke claimed that the evidence he found suggested Percy might have done it to himself with a sharp blade. Lion grabbed Jade, unable to believe Percy would do something so reckless, especially with such a bright future ahead of him. However, Jax calmed down faster than Lion and began to analyze how it could have happened, since they were the only ones on the island and the staff hadn't arrived yet. The little girl looked at the boys, and she noticed that Jax seemed to think Percy was responsible for whatever had happened. Lion became very upset, and he now started blaming himself, because talking about his sister had plunged Percy back into his dark mood regarding Elise. The whole thing felt wrong to Lee. She didn't believe that a year after Elise's death, Percy would suddenly lose the will to live. The Duke watched Lee with great interest as she stood there quietly, piecing together the events of the day, recalling when Percy had been optimistic and cheerful. Cullen walked over to the little girl, worried by her frightened appearance, even though this wasn't the first time Lee had seen someone die recently. The little girl said nothing to the man, simply grabbing his hand. Jax turned to Cullen and directly implied that the Duke's family was the first to find Percy, even though all the guests on the island had been together before that. The Duke let out a soft laugh, as if to say that this university student actually thought his family would plot the death of some nobody. Cullen, who had examined the scene earlier, said that judging by the bloodstains on the leaves, Percy had been dead long before he and his family climbed the hill. Suddenly, all eyes fell on Lion, as he was the last one to enter the woods to signal the servants, and the time he was gone matched Percy's time of death perfectly. Everyone looked at Percy's body, and the Duke announced that for now, it seemed Percy had orchestrated his own death, and no one present could be blamed, but they all had to stay on the island until the police arrived. Lion held Jax, trying to comfort him, but Lee, watching the group of young men, also began to suspect something was amiss with the whole situation. The little girl gripped the Duke's hand tighter, now wondering why she was so sure Percy's death had been staged. The Duke didn't like how quiet the little girl was and began to worry she was unwell. The man took off his gloves, wanting to check if the girl had a fever after her recent recovery. Cullen reached for her forehead, though Lee tried to reassure him not to worry. Suddenly, as the man's hand pressed more firmly against her forehead, she felt a strong wave of dizziness. A vision flashed through Lee's mind, a strange house built on a rocky cliff by the sea. In the yard, some young people were playing and roughhousing, and a girl in a blue dress was trying to hide from a boy. He dashed out from behind another tree to catch her, taking her completely by surprise. Lee just stood there, watching these children play in a garden, but she didn't know whose memory she was seeing. She tried to see the boy's face clearly, but it became a frantic blur of faces and then began to dissipate. Lee only came to her senses after Cullen called her name a few times. Jade and the Duke were worried about her, and he promised that as soon as the police arrived, they would go home so Lee could get some rest. Lee glanced at the shore where their boat was docked, terrified by the strange vision she had just seen with her eyes wide open. Jade put his arm around her, promising she could get a good sleep as soon as they returned to the estate. Jade held the little girl tightly, but Lee overheard that her family also thought the whole thing was a setup, a premeditated murder. The family stared at the shore, all of them knowing there must be someone else on the island, someone who had arrived earlier, because if the killer had come by boat, they would have heard it immediately. Jade joked that maybe a mermaid did it, but the Duke wasn't amused and just told the children to wait for the police. Lee thought that if the killer was on the island, they might still be among those who hadn't left. The little girl suddenly realized that the vision she saw might be the key to solving the case. Lee looked at Lion and Jax, thinking that the culprit must be the one who was a poor actor. Lion was comforting his crying friend when Lee realized that the wrongdoer would soon have to face Cullen's wrath. The police arrived on the island, and a team of guards took away Percy's body. Many of the staff members said the poor boy had a bright future. Jax was talking to a police officer, admitting that Percy was a skilled fencer, so he could have easily used a dagger too, and it all. Lee stood next to the police captain, who was eyeing the Duke suspiciously. This wasn't the first time he had been involved in a bizarre incident where someone had died. The girl recognized the officer. He had been there when the red-haired woman had died suddenly on the pavement from a heart attack. Cullen asked the officer if they could leave the island now that the police had questioned his family. The captain had no choice but to give his permission and let the Duke leave. The captain walked away to see Jax, so Cullen took the little girl's hand and walked towards the riverbank. Jax started crying loudly again, begging the police to let them go home. The little girl watched it all, then tugged on the Duke's coat and confessed that she felt very sorry for Lion. Jade returned to his family waiting on the hill, and the little girl asked if they could take Lion with them, as she felt very sorry for the guy after hearing about his deceased sister. Lee offered to comfort Lion on the way home, and her words took the other young man by surprise. The girl looked at the Duke, pointing out that if Jax and Lion stayed together, they would just end up blaming each other for not looking after Percy. The Duke was impressed by his daughter's kindness, so Jade pushed a nervous Lion towards the shore. The Leveton family walked towards the riverbank, and the little girl was glad she hadn't left Lion and Jax together in a bad situation. Lee glanced back at Lion, and though she wasn't entirely sure, she hoped her intuition was right. The police were still searching the area around the blue rose bushes, but no one noticed Jax standing there alone. The family's carriage arrived at the port, ready to take the Leveton family back to the estate. Lee grabbed Lion's hand, trying to get him into the carriage, but the boy was terrified and tried to make any excuse for the Duke's family to leave him at the port. Cullen wasn't having it. He didn't want to disappoint her when she was just trying to help the guy, so he personally pushed Lion into the carriage. In the evening, the carriage finally left the port area. The whole family and Lion sat in complete silence as the carriage drove through the fields. Cullen smirked at the little one, knowing his daughter had already discovered a major clue about the incident on the island. Lion sat opposite the little one, who already knew he had gotten rid of Percy with some kind of dirty trick, but she didn't know why he did it. The silence was suffocating, and Lion glanced anxiously at the scenery outside the window. The little one secretly watched the Duke, eager to share her deductions with someone. As the carriage continued towards the estate, Lee tried to work up the courage to involve Cullen in unmasking the killer, though she worried he wouldn't want to understand the life circumstances that drove Lion to do it. The Duke had his eyes closed, looking cool, but Lee saw the exhaustion on his face. She remembered that in the legends of the Leveton family, he had never found true happiness, so his life was rather depressing. The carriage stopped by a small patch of countryside. The little one looked around through the window and decided they had reached the right spot. She tugged on the Duke's sleeve to get his attention. Lee lied, saying that a decoration from her teddy bear had fallen off and flown out the window. The girl reminded him that just that morning, Maryanne had tied a ribbon on the bear, the same color as the one in her hair. So the Duke had no choice but to knock on the window, and the carriage stopped in an alley beside a country road. The coachman opened the door, listened to his master's request to find the ribbon, and accepted a silver coin as a reward. Lion was startled by the stop, sweat dripping down his face, and the guy couldn't say a word. Suddenly, the guy jumped up, ready to bolt from the carriage, thanking the Duke for his time and help as he went. Lee was now completely certain that this was the escape route Lion was supposed to have all along. The girl rushed in front of the man, asking him to take a minute to answer a question. The guy slumped back in his seat when Lee asked if they had really never met before. Lion started making excuses, saying he would have surely remembered Lee, but he fell silent when she firmly asked who he really was. The girl declared that she had seen Lion in the past, and her words unsettled Jade. Cullen was also confused when Lee asked Lion to tell her the exact color of the train station's clock tower. The guy reminded her that the clock tower was gold, and Lee agreed with him. Just then, Lee caught the man in his lie, because on the island, he had claimed the clock tower was a different color. The girl realized she had a chance to catch the criminal and coldly pointed out that on the island, he had said the clock tower was blue, and her words sent Lion into a great panic. The guy tried to hide his anxiety, lying that he might have misremembered after having a few drinks with his friends. Lee continued to question him, confirming that the clock tower was, in fact, blue, which threw him into disarray. The little girl knew the clock tower was painted with a special pigment that made it look blue at night and gold during the day. For the orphans, the color of the clock tower was significant, so when they agreed to meet at the blue clock tower, it meant the gathering was planned for the evening. The little girl remembered that a long time ago, her street friends had invited her to see the trains, and they had snuck into the station during the day. She and her friends had run around the station that day, and the clock tower was definitely gold. But Lee also knew that the train stopped running at 6 in the evening, and the station entrance was guarded. So the only people who could sneak into the station late at night were the village children, who were involved in petty theft. Lee decided not to hide the truth any longer, as she had already met Lion at the meeting spot by the blue clock tower, because they had grown up in the same tough neighborhood. The guy knew he couldn't refute the girl's guess and listened silently to her deduction about knowing his journey from the village. Near the station, Cullen proudly watched the little girl reach the key conclusion. There might not be just one lion, but two. Terrified, Lion realized his secret was about to be exposed and scrambled for an excuse. Suddenly, someone grabbed the carriage door handle from the outside. Before the little girl could react, she was yanked out. In a flash, the stranger, dressed exactly like Lion, held a dagger to her throat and ordered everyone not to move. The guy yelled at the Duke to let Lion go. The stranger held the girl hostage, but she had already realized that her vision was about more than just one person. In her vision, she had seen a pair of twin brothers having fun in the garden. With Elise, Cullen caught the guy's attention, demanding he release the little girl, and then he would give him a clean end. The Duke's words enraged the twin, who gripped Lee tighter, threatening to cut her if the Duke didn't release his brother. The Duke was already summoning his shadow magic, doubting this kid had the guts to harm his daughter. Suddenly, a dark shadow shot past Lee's cheek and slammed into the man. The twin let go of the girl and went flying. He cringed in pain, the dagger slipping to one side, but he couldn't get up to defend against the magic. Cullen stepped out of the carriage, furious that some country boy dared to threaten him with his daughter's life. Magical shadows swirled around the Duke, amplifying his already raging emotions. The Duke walked past Lee towards the twin, the dark magic already hovering in the air, binding the man and rendering him immobile. The man began to cast a spell, promising to give the guy a truly painful death. A scream came from inside the carriage. Lion jumped from his seat, tried to run out, and help Lyndon break free from the magic's hold. Jade followed the guy out, then pulled a dagger from his jacket pocket and pinned Lion against the carriage wall, the tip at his throat. Both brothers were now in a desperate situation, but suddenly, Lee's voice came from the street, pleading with her family to calm down and listen to her. Jade was confused, but Lee demanded the twins tell the whole truth. First, the little girl looked at Cullen, pleading with him to grant her wish. The man dispersed the magical shadows, deciding to let Lee continue to unravel this strange case, much to the little girl's surprise. But then, the Duke reached for his dagger, threatening to severely maim the twins' hands for threatening his little daughter. Cullen grabbed the guy's arm, but Lee started swearing to her father that she wasn't hurt at all, so Lyndon was not to be touched. The Duke tossed the arm away like trash, while Jade dragged Lion out of the carriage. The family dragged the twins into a hangar, and Cullen bound them both with magical ropes. The magical rope wrapped around Lion's shoulders tightened, turning into a shadow serpent. Lee was surprised by the serpent, as she thought the magical shadows looked like chains. The girl sized up the twins, noticing that one of them was sitting there with his clothes completely soaked. Jade was demanding answers. When did the twins switch places, and which one of them took out Percy? The brothers looked at each other, but they weren't about to give up their secret. The Duke joined the conversation, demanding to know how his daughter had figured out the twins' scheme. Lee tried to de-escalate the tension, suggesting they should first figure out what exactly happened on that island. The Duke complained that Lee had a strange knack for annoying him, which upset the poor girl. The man retracted a part of the serpent, freeing one of the twins' mouths from the ropes. Cullen grabbed the guy's chin, promising that if he lied, his brother would regret it dearly. Jade put away his dagger and told his father to stop making threats while Lee could hear. The man walked away from the twin and ordered him to start telling the truth and answer his daughter's questions. The twin confessed that he had eliminated Percy as planned. He and his brother had switched places when Lion went to pick flowers. So on the island, it was Lyndon who stayed with Percy's friends in Lion's place, stalling them while his brother hid in the blue rose bushes, waiting for Percy. After dealing with Percy, the twins staged his death. So when Lyndon went to signal the servants, the brothers switched places again. Lee listened to the brothers' story, but she was worried about what they had given Percy to keep him from screaming. Lion said they weren't that stupid, so they had prepared a cloth soaked in a special substance that made Percy pass out instantly. The twin admitted that Percy was an easy target because they knew he was the only one who gave Elise blue gifts, so they found the guy's weakness. Lion lowered his head, but his voice was steady as he said he didn't regret what he did, because Percy was a real bastard who had bullied their sister. The twins came from a very poor family, so when they were little, their parents decided to give Lyndon up for adoption to some distant relatives. Eventually, Lyndon's adoptive family went bankrupt, so he ended up on the streets as a child and learned to pickpocket. One day, Lyndon was caught stealing. It turned out he was trying to steal Lion's wallet, and that's how the brothers finally met. He realized then that from that moment on, the brothers could live as one person. Lion confessed that after reuniting with his brother, they took turns going to school so that Lyndon could get back in touch with his noble lineage. Now, Jade understood. The twins were trained to be identical, and when he met Lion at the academy, he seemed to act differently each time. But the brothers' story didn't distract Jade from the main question. Why did they decide to take out Percy? Lion said that Percy was the one responsible for their sister's death. When Elise was alive, she grew more beautiful with each passing year, to the point where young nobles were lining up to be engaged to her. Among these nobles, some were willing to pay a penalty to have Elise break off an engagement and become engaged to another noble. So when Percy heard these kinds of rumors, he decided to take advantage of the girl. The Duke listened intently to the twins' story, realizing that Percy had always been an overly greedy fellow who decided to take advantage of the family's wealth. Lee was moved by their story, but she couldn't grasp the true consequences of Percy's decision. Lion was touched by Lee's insight, as if an old soul was trapped in a little girl's body, so he decided to trust her and tell her everything Percy had done. After Percy heard the rumors, he got dead drunk at a summer wedding one day and decided to stay with Elise, but Percy was a complete mess when he was drunk. Jade and Lee were stunned when Lion confessed that Percy had gone to Elise that day with a group of other men. The brothers recalled that time with pain, and Lion whispered that in wealthy families, all suicides are covered up as death from pneumonia. That day, Elise had called the brothers to her bedroom and confessed everything that had happened, but it didn't ease her pain, and she took her own life. Lee realized it was all about revenge, but Cullen was curious why the brothers would do this if they hadn't even lived with their sister. For a long time, Lion blurted out that they had only been together once at the family estate. Those memories of the three of them having fun and enjoying family time were forever etched in their minds. Lee thought about the vision she had of the estate built on the rocky cliffs. Lion tried to absolve his brother, confessing that he was the one who killed Percy and was willing to endure any dark magic experiments, just to keep Lyndon alive. Callan scoffed, saying the rumors about his dark magic skills had been exaggerated into horror stories about experiments. The twins looked at the child, their last question being how Ray had discovered their meeting place. Callan and Jade stared at the girl, making her feel very uncomfortable. The little girl remembered that they had all been together during the time Percy went missing. So if someone had done away with Percy, it must have been someone who was on the island with them. But after the police showed up and searched the entire island without finding anyone else, Ray deduced that the killer must have slipped away before they arrived. When Ray and Jade were taking the boat to the island, the child noticed a small bridge over the river, and she realized there was enough space between the bridge and the water to swim through. Furthermore, the children saw a tunnel under the bridge leading underground, which could be entered directly from the bank. The Duke and Jade glared fiercely at the twins. Lytton wanted to say something, but his mouth was still sealed by the magical shadow. But Ray said she had been to where the tunnel led, which terrified him. The girl smiled. All the street kids knew about that secret tunnel, but her deduction, with its sharp line of thinking, truly surprised the Duke. Ray admitted that anyone who knew about the Blue Tower would also know about the secret tunnel, and that was how she solved the case, though she said nothing about learning the secret information from the Leveton family. "Tell me everything." The child looked at the twins, She needed to know the story of the older brother, the one who only wanted to avenge his sister's death. The brothers were sweating nervously, wondering why the Duke hadn't punished them yet. They tried to gauge what would happen next, but the elder man was in no hurry. He had long had an ominous premonition about Percy's death. Now back on the island, Callan had deliberately made Ray take Ryan and Lytton to the small hill so that he could find the killer and track him. Jade tried to defend the brothers, saying that Lytton might not have known about Ryan's plan and might not have been directly involved in the crime. The man admitted he sympathized with the twins, as he was now an older brother too and had to take care of the younger one. Jade walked over to the twins, warning what would happen if anyone dared to lay a finger on Ray. The man clapped the brothers on the shoulders and, with a sweet smile, promised that if anything happened to Ray, he would not hesitate to take them out. Jade looked at Ray and suggested that the twins could be forgiven, as their actions were not born of malice. But now it was Ray's turn to decide the brothers' fate, and the girl felt overwhelmed as Jade was asking for forgiveness while the Duke maintained a hard stance. The Duke implied that as a father, he insisted on their execution, which caught Jade off guard, and he promised not to interfere with his father's decision. Ray's mind raced, for Callan had already decided the fellow's fate, but she wanted to salvage everything and bring things to a satisfactory conclusion. Recalling Alice from her vision, Ray felt that even though she had never met the girl, she was very sad about what had happened to her. The girl looked at Callan and declared that he should do what he would not regret later. She remembered from the book that Callan was a hero forced onto a bloody path of hunting other criminals. But no matter what he had to do, he always continued on the path of a dark hero. Despite Callan's difficult past, he now had no sympathy for criminals, no matter how noble their intentions. Ray hoped that this time, the man would make a different decision. Lytton and Ryan were different from the murderers Callan hunted. They just wanted to clear their sister's name, so Callan shouldn't tarnish his soul after hearing their story. The Duke approached the little girl, thanking her for being so persistent in seeking the truth. Encouraged by his words, Ray shielded the twins and begged the Duke to just hand them over to the police. But Callan was more interested in something else, which took Ray by surprise. He wanted to know the names of Percy's friends, the ones who had abused Alice. The man leaned toward the teenagers to demand the information, as he was sure the brothers would never forget the names of those who had wronged her. The brothers looked at Callan suspiciously as he tried to persuade them to introduce him to the culprits. Callan promised that if they helped, he would let the twins go, but they would still owe his daughter a debt. Jade smirked and sat down next to his brother. He told Ryan to remember to say hello the next time he saw him. The next time they met, the teenagers smiled. Jade was beginning to appreciate Ryan's nerve, but suddenly, Jade threatened again that if he dared to speak to his little sister, he would take him out. Jade found the situation amusing, but he was curious why Ryan had killed Percy so easily, as revenge for a loved one should have been more intense. Hearing Jade's words, Ray turned pale, even though her opinion of him had been on the verge of changing. The Duke approached the girl and promised he would personally handle the aftermath of the Alice incident. Ray knew from the book that Callan was an eater, and the dark magic forced him to absorb mana from people. In certain specific cases, an eater was allowed to absorb a person's mana. The targets were usually murderers or people who had just recently died. But there were also those whose crimes were considered the most heinous, namely, harming the pure soul of a young girl. Ray looked at the twins. She knew Callan treated all criminals the same, but she also agreed that those who abused Alice deserved to be punished. The Duke released the magical shackles, and the twins, with tears in their eyes, were relieved to still be alive. They couldn't believe their luck, but Callan hinted that those who have tasted blood once, their nature is hard to change. The man snapped his fingers, placing an invisible mark on the twins, promising he would watch them forever and that they would not get a second chance. The teenagers nervously checked each other while Jade glared at them, looking ready for a fight. Callan walked toward the carriage and called for Ray. The man picked up the little girl, climbed into the carriage, and looked back to say thanks for the upcoming treat. The twins were left there, completely clueless as to what the Duke was talking about. The man smiled, because Percy's body was fresh and met the criteria for an eater. It dawned on Ray why her father had told her to wait a while on the hill before calling for help. Jade began to close the carriage door. He didn't feel sorry for Percy, but it was still hard to see his father devour the mana of someone he knew. Ryan heard the conversation from the carriage and tried to figure out what Jade meant, but the twin got no answer as the door slammed shut. Callan was enjoying this new line of detective work. He didn't know what the future would hold if he stayed with Ray, but he was already enjoying their initial success. The man had the girl sit next to him and announced that he had finally figured out who she was. The child began to panic, but the Duke just chuckled and said she was a complete prodigy. His words left her speechless, and she just stared at him in complete shock. Then, Ray started waving her hands, complaining that she was just guessing, but no one believed her, as this was not the first time she had shown amazing insight. As the carriage moved on, Jade mused that Ray had a knack for remembering all sorts of facts despite never having gone to school. The girl tried to defend herself, saying that if she were a genius, she wouldn't have grown up on the streets and still not even know how to write. Suddenly, her gaze fell upon the city streets the carriage was entering. The little girl saw two orphans warming themselves under an old blanket. As the carriage passed through the main street, the girl realized this winter would be very harsh. Jade watched the little girl's serious expression. He was concerned that she cared so much about the children on the street. The Duke ruffled the child's hair, but assured her they needed to visit a scientist friend who would test her abilities. But the man's words did not reassure the little one. Now she thought that if she failed the test, Callan might abandon her after some time. The carriage entered the courtyard of the Leveton family estate. Cheyenne was already in the foyer of the house. He politely opened the door and welcomed the family. The butler tried to figure out why the young lady looked so tired, but the Duke walked past him proudly and announced that their Ray was a true prodigy. Cheyenne couldn't figure out the exact reason for the Duke's good mood, but he decided not to ask any more questions. Late at night, after everyone in the estate had returned to their bedrooms, Ray lay alone in bed in her room. At dinner tonight, the Duke had been bragging about Ray's skills. The girl shot up in bed when there was a knock on the door. Jade's face appeared at the door, but the man didn't rush into the bedroom, thinking of just checking on her. He walked over to the bed and asked Ray why she always looked so downcast whenever they passed the intersection where she used to live. The little girl hugged her teddy bear tightly and decided to trust her older brother. She confessed that in the alley behind that intersection, she had spent many difficult times. Ray clutched the toy to her chest, saying that every time she saw that intersection, or even just thought about the past, it sent a shiver down her spine. Jade told her to tell him everything. Ray told Jade not to worry about her, and that although she missed her friends, she still remembered the golden rule of orphans. If someone finds a good home, don't look for each other again. Her brother wished the little one sweet dreams and left her room. The girl fell back onto the bed, though she wasn't very sleepy yet. She began to stare at the ceiling, recalling the vision that appeared when Callan touched her. Ray looked at her palm. Unlike in the book, where things had a set course, everything was different now, and she didn't know how to handle these visions. But after a difficult day, Ray quickly fell asleep. Life in the estate went on as usual, but Callan never mentioned Ray being a genius again. During that time, after the Duke finished reading the newspaper, he suggested that Ray go for a walk in town. The suggestion excited the little one. The Duke suggested that after he finished some work, they would go to the cafe that Ray and Maryanne had visited. Ray immediately remembered all the delicious desserts she had tasted at that cafe. The girl couldn't wait and ran back to her room to change, but Cheyenne told her to get help from a maid. Callan was pleased that a lively and active child, so different from other noble children, had come to his home. Just as the family was preparing to go to town, a carriage arrived at the estate gate. The maids changed Ray into an autumn outfit, which pleased Callan even more. The girl shyly asked the man if she could hold his hand, which filled Callan's heart with even more love for her. The man couldn't help himself and pulled Ray into a tight embrace. The girl was stunned but still asked the Duke to hold her hand. Ray grabbed the man's palm, but this time no new vision appeared in her mind. The girl didn't let go. Although she had tried to hold the man's hand every time after the Lennox Island incident, no vision had appeared, just like today. The carriage set off with the family, though Ray was sad because she didn't know how to unlock her ability again. After a while, the Levitons arrived on a main street in the city. A huge iron sign appeared before them. Ray squinted, trying to read the name of the institute. Callan walked to the entrance of the institution, promising that Dr. Sybil would only conduct a small test. Ray realized she had been tricked with the excuse of going to a cafe, just as her parents in her previous life had tricked her into going to the dentist. The Duke dragged the resisting Ray into the institute. After all, everything he had planned was for her own good. The girl saw through the man's lie and tried to fake cry, but the Duke was already heading up the stairs to the doctor's office. A blond man greeted the Levitons and told them to go to another office. Ray sized him up, thinking he was too young to be a doctor. Callan led the child into the office and warned the doctor that security would be patrolling outside while he was away, and if anything happened to his daughter, the doctor would surely regret it. Ray grabbed the man's coat, but he promised to return as soon as he finished his business, so she needed to stay with the doctor for a while. The Duke wasn't falling for it. He pulled her off his coat and said sharply that he would be back soon. Then he disappeared behind the door, which closed with a loud bang. The man introduced himself as Dr. Sybil and tried to win her over with a friendly attitude. Ray puffed out her cheeks and sullenly told the doctor her name. Clearly annoyed, the doctor chuckled, saying she looked like a sulky puppy when she was angry. The man had her sit at his desk while she sized up the doctoral degree certificate he had obtained at such a young age. The doctor's desk was filled with all sorts of scientific instruments. He promised that people like him help people like Ray, because if a person has the potential to be a genius, it needs to be nurtured. Sybil sat across from her, saying that he and the Duke just wanted to help and that the test wouldn't affect Ray's life at all. The child tried to end the meeting with the doctor and assured him that there was nothing special about her. The man realized the girl was worried about the results and told her that all children from noble families go through this procedure. Sybil said that all loving parents believe in their children's potential, which is why they bring them to the institute. The man began to rummage through his desk, explaining that the Duke didn't want anything from this test, unlike other parents who desperately wanted to find some sign of genius in their children. The doctor looked under the desk and said from below that if the test showed suitable abilities, he was obliged to help Ray manage her curriculum. The child anxiously squeezed her toy as Sybil asked her what format she preferred for answering his questions. Suddenly, there was a loud bang that startled Ray as the doctor lost his footing and hit his head hard on the desk. The man grabbed his head, but reassured Ray not to worry about him. The doctor found a stack of papers he needed and suggested they start the test. Sybil set up a series of challenges, some about concentration, where Ray had to find her way out of a maze. Then, while they were playing chess, the doctor would randomly quiz her with math problems. Ray tried to answer his questions, but she didn't know all the answers, as she hadn't spent much time studying in either this life or her previous one. But she was curious about learning new things, and even while playing chess, she asked many questions about how the pieces moved. The doctor calmly observed Ray's reasoning, without suddenly changing the subject to distract her. After 2 hours, their test tasks were completed, and Sybil asked Ray to wait in the office while he analyzed the results. Ray remained at the table. She wasn't tired after all the tests, so she felt that being a genius was easy. She began to dream about how geniuses deal with all sorts of numbers, inventing and creating new things. During the boring wait for the doctor, the little girl began to worry about what Sybil had said about many parents being disappointed when they found out their children were not geniuses. Ray concluded that Callan wanted her to be involved in his work in this way because he had promised to listen to her opinions. But if her abilities were not useful, would the man kick her out of the mansion? Although Ray thought she might be kept on as the lowest-ranking servant, scrubbing floors all day. These depressing thoughts almost brought Ray to tears, especially since the test results could take several days. Footsteps were heard in the hallway, and the little girl turned toward the door. Callan, having finished his work, entered the study. The man sat down next to Ray, and seeing her dejected expression, he demanded to know what the doctor had done. The girl tried to hold back her tears, but couldn't hide the truth, admitting that she was not a genius. Callan was stunned when his little daughter said she hadn't been able to answer a single question on the test. The Duke tried to comfort Ray as she began to explain that with her ordinary memory, she would be of no help in his line of work. Ray stopped crying, but she was still worried now that Callan knew she was no prodigy. Callan held the girl tighter and pulled her closer. He told her that as a father, she was his greatest joy, so things like test results didn't matter. The Duke hugged the little one, explaining that he just wanted to see if she had any special talents so that he and Jade would know how to help her develop them. Ray snuggled into the man's arms, She knew that being adopted into the Duke's family made her different. Callan explained that sometimes people are born with a knack for learning certain things, but those with strong mental abilities must be controlled or it could lead to some serious mental health problems. So Callan decided to prepare in advance for the possibility that Ray might have certain abilities, as Jade had not shown any powerful skills at her age. The Duke held the little girl tightly, promising he would be happy with whatever she achieved, because every parent dreams of a child like her. The man patted Ray's back, admitting that not everyone can be a genius, and some are destined to be less gifted. The Duke told Ray not to worry, to just live a carefree life and spend his money, because she was the daughter he had always wanted. Ray wasn't quite sure if being comforted by such a man was reliable, but at least she stopped crying. Callan reminded her of his promise to take her to the cafe, and her mood instantly brightened. The man decided to wait for the doctor to get his opinion, as he was already dragging a large pile of documents out of his office. Dr. Sybil was excited. He had analyzed the results, but their conversation about it would be a long one. The Duke urged the doctor on, and the doctor nervously threw the results sheet on the table, saying that although Ray was not a direct genius, her ability level was extremely high. The doctor rummaged through the papers for a moment more and announced that the girl had a talent that could lead her to genius. The Duke couldn't take it anymore, slammed his fist on the table, and demanded the doctor say clearly what he meant. Sybil handed the answer sheets to Callan, convinced that Ray had a talent for learning different languages and superior logical abilities. Ray and the Duke were completely confused as the doctor rattled on about all the girl's special traits, but he ultimately recommended she focus on studying computational science. But all Callan heard from the doctor was one thing: his daughter was definitely a genius. In an instant, the Duke's face lit up, and now he was convinced of Ray's incredible talent. Callan poked Ray's nose and told her that even if she was a bit silly, being smart and rich would make her life much more interesting. The man started to lead the little girl toward the exit, but the doctor asked the young lady to stay and talk with him. The request annoyed the Duke, who menacingly suggested that the doctor had already spent enough time with his daughter. Sybil tried to explain, asking for Ray to come to his office. The Duke's mood soured, and he didn't understand why they couldn't just discuss everything right here. The doctor stammered in fear, but he asked the man to step aside so that Ray could talk freely about her abilities. Ray rushed to the doctor's office, though she felt the Duke's burning gaze on her back. The girl had never been in a science lab before. The whole place was piled with books and research equipment, so Ray was stunned by the sight. The doctor mentioned there were special programs for people like Ray, but the Duke probably wouldn't let her attend because he was overprotective. The child looked around the lab, but she felt that something was off about the whole room. Sybil sat down at the table and announced that Ray was about to take her final test. Ray was curious what kind of puzzle the doctor had prepared for her in the lab. The girl began to examine the room, noticing that all the furniture and walls had a lot in common with the next room. Ray thought that if the extra things were cleared away, the two rooms would be almost identical. Ray focused on finding the differences, and her gaze immediately fell on the painting hanging near the entrance. The child approached the wall to get a closer look at the forest scene. She remembered a similar painting in the other room, but that one depicted two paths forming a cross. The painting in the lab, however, showed a fence surrounded by flowers. Ray's brain began to piece the clues together. A cross in one painting and a circle in the other. The fence was circular. All of this had to lead to an answer. Ray asked the doctor if there was a book in the lab with a title that mentioned a cross and a circle. Sybil walked to the bookshelf, pulled out a thick book, and was amazed at Ray's unconventional thinking. The child took the book, but not quite believing she had solved the puzzle. She looked around again. On the bookshelf, Lou noticed a circular symbol hidden behind a book. The girl pieced the clues together. The drawing had given her a cross and a circle, but after finding the book, she discovered another circle. Lou was pondering all the possible meanings of two circles and a cross when she had a flash of insight. It was the infinity symbol. She asked the doctor for a book titled Infinity, which greatly surprised the man. Sybil took out a white book titled The Endless Admirer and showed it to Lou, opening the book. Lou found a congratulatory note. The doctor praised her for solving the entire puzzle, although her initial guess had also been correct. Cullen was trying to wait patiently in the institute's hallway, but he was about to lose his patience. The doctor pointed to an address on the back of his business card, telling Lou she could come to him if she ever needed any help. Sybil patted Lou's shoulder, admitting that many people didn't understand him when he was a child, so he would be happy to help Lou adapt to her new abilities. The man knelt before the girl, promising that as a teacher, he would always find a way to help her. If she came to his lab, Sybil reminded Lou that the Duke was always proud of her talents, no matter how big or small. This insight stunned Lou, who felt the doctor must be able to read her mind, as she was just worrying about how Cullen would react. Suddenly, a loud bang startled Lou and Sybil. The Duke's patience had run out, and he was pounding on the lab door with all his might, suspecting something must have happened for his daughter to be in some man's office for so long. The doctor frantically ran to open the door, swearing he was just giving Lou another test. Lou showed off the doctor's business card, but Cullen was not impressed by the man's behavior. Cullen looked at Lou as she spoke to him. The little one confessed that she was grateful the Duke was proud of her. Cullen ruffled Lou's hair, moved by her promise to stay with him forever. Even so, Cullen managed to hint that Lou should call him Dad, so he wouldn't feel awkward. As the Duke turned to leave the office, Sybil stood anxiously by the desk. The Duke said his goodbyes, saying he would send an assistant to settle the bill. Now in a good mood, Lou waved goodbye to the doctor, excited about their upcoming trip to a cafe. The Leveton family left the institute. Sybil watched them go, and as soon as they were out of his sight, he let out an ominous smirk, for his suspicions about Lou had been correct. The man walked to another bookshelf and took something out of a hidden compartment. Although impressed by the results, Sybil still wished the girl had found the box with the red flower. The man inhaled the fragrance of the red flower petals, completely captivated. Remembering his secret guest, the man walked to a hidden door and began to slide the bookcase aside. In the secret room, set up as a secret lab, a person was kept inside a blue container. So Lou had not solved the big question. Where was the real Dr. Sybil? The man entered the secret room, dispelled his magical disguise, and a flower tattoo appeared on his hand. He was disappointed that Lou hadn't figured out the whole truth, but now he had some different plans for her. With a smirk, Sybil knocked on the blue container holding the sleeping, real Dr. Sybil and asked to borrow his name for a little while longer. After spending some time with the girl, Sybil was certain she would grow up to be a remarkable woman. After dropping the child off at the institute for her test, Cullen went about his own business and was now observing a student from the academy. The student calmly watched an argument at the academy gate, unconcerned about its cause. Nearby, a group of teenagers started gossiping about Percy's early death, spreading rumors that he had killed himself out of love for his late bride. The student finished his cigarette, amused by Percy's recklessness, as he felt there were plenty of women in their world. The guy walked toward the carriage, even feeling glad that Percy would never know what he had done to his bride at the manor that weekend. The student threw away his cigarette, not noticing a stranger appearing behind him. Suddenly, a strong hand grabbed the punk and slammed his head into the pavement. Cullen had already unleashed his dark magic and was gloating over the student, for he had come to collect his soul. The punk was terrified, but he didn't have enough strength to push the Duke away. The man conjured a magical rope to bind the punk, then sneered at him that only scum would try to cover up the murder of women with money. Cullen stepped on the student, crushing him to the ground. Before this meeting, he had done his homework and found that this lowlife had a long list of unsolved cases against women on his hands. The man made no secret of his disgust. He terrified the punk with stories of what would happen when he decided to devour his mana, sending him into a pure panic. The student tried to push the Duke's foot away, his mouth sealed by a dark shadow, so no one could hear him. So Cullen promised again that his death would be excruciating. The punk managed to squirm, but was slammed back down. The Duke declared that for his daughter's sake, he would get rid of monsters like him. Cullen grabbed the black noose tied around the punk's neck, deciding there was no need to delay the punishment any longer. The Duke summoned the magical spirit of a giant dark serpent, preparing to devour the student's mana. After dealing with this little problem, Cullen glanced at his watch. He still had time to pick up the child from the university. The man turned without a word and walked towards the city's main road. After a long day, Cullen and Lou arrived at a cafe, where the man asked them to bring out all the cakes that they had. The child only ordered one slice of dessert, but he looked at her strangely and asked if she was sure that was enough. Lou thought about it and figured that since she was a genius now and had done so much thinking, she could probably eat 2 slices of cake. The Duke turned to look out the window. The girl didn't understand what had upset him. Suddenly, the man handed the menu back to the waiter and demanded they bring all the desserts. Before long, the cafe staff brought out a huge platter filled with every flavor of dessert you could imagine. Lou was ecstatic. She hadn't even realized how hungry she was. The child began to sample the treats, but she was curious why the Duke was in such a good mood when he came back to pick her up and why his tie was different. Cullen once again admired his daughter's attentiveness. His clothes had been wrinkled after the confrontation with the student, and Cheyenne had helped him tidy up. The man crossed his arms and lied that he had just run into an old friend and had a pleasant chat. Lou continued to devour her desserts, while Cullen noticed a group of police officers running down the street toward the academy. The Duke watched the officers leave. He was sure the student's body wouldn't give them any clues, and the conclusion would be death by unknown causes. Cullen decided to ignore this crime in the capital and just enjoy the moment watching the little one eat. The man admitted he wished every day could be like this, just being together. But Lou didn't understand the meaning behind his words. The Duke showered Lou with praise, telling her how adorable she was and how much he wanted to make her happy. Lou's cheeks flushed, but she was happy to be able to make the Duke happy. Although Cullen wanted her to call him Dad, he didn't press the issue for now. The day had gone too smoothly. After lunch, Cullen and Lou left the cafe, politely bidding farewell to the staff. The Duke invited the little girl to go on a trip with him. A carriage was waiting next to the cafe, where Cheyenne and Jade were waiting for the little one and her father. Jade was in a good mood and assured Lou that the day was about to get even better for her. In the evening, the family set off in the carriage. Although Lou was wearing an autumn coat, she began to feel cold. Lou looked out the window. She noticed an alley near an intersection and realized the cold was coming from her unpleasant memories of living on the streets. The carriage traveled a little further down the street, and Lou saw something unusual at the intersection. The carriage screeched to a halt on the road. Lou jumped out excitedly because the street had been transformed. Without waiting for her family to catch up, the little girl ran towards the intersection. The girl was lost in memories, recalling how the owner of one of the houses used to pretend not to see the orphans rummaging through the trash for scraps. Sometimes the children would stay in a warehouse, huddled together in a circle, trying to keep warm under a single tattered blanket. But all these places had vanished from the street. A brand new, tall building now stood where the slums used to be. The little one looked around and found a plaque next to the back door. She had learned enough letters to recognize that the sign said the building was a children's home. Lou felt too shy to walk right in, so she peeked through a window instead. Inside was a large living room with a fireplace, a warm carpet, and piles of toys. The Leveton family walked up to Lou, and the Duke explained that it was a project he and Jade had come up with to make the little one happier. Jade confessed that he wanted to wipe the look of worry from Lou's face, the one she got every time they drove past this intersection, so he decided to do something to erase the sadness from the little girl's face. Cullen leaned down to the child. He had long since noticed that Lou wanted to do something about the connections between the orphans. Lou remembered that a few days ago, Jade had come to her room, and they had talked a lot about how the orphans could adapt to a good life. The fact that this was no longer a secret panicked her, and she got angry at Jade. The Duke looked around. He promised that he had paid all the homeowners on this street a large sum of money when he bought the land to construct the building. Cullen assured the child that only children could enter this orphanage and that they would be absolutely safe there for the entire winter. This really moved Lou, and she couldn't be more grateful to the family. Cullen seized the opportunity to tell Lou that as a father figure, he was happy to help her, though he really wanted to be her dad. From somewhere nearby, Jade told her to call him brother. Lou panicked. She had never called Cullen Dad before and wasn't used to it, as she could leave this home at any moment. But she couldn't help herself. She threw herself into Cullen's arms and called him Dad. She hugged him, thanking them for giving her a dad who cared and a brother. Lou jumped up to hug Jade. Although the Leveton family could seem intimidating at times, she felt really good being with them. Her brother patted the little one's head, telling her to let go of all the sad thoughts associated with this intersection. The family returned to the carriage, and Jade mentioned he had been looking for Walter, but word was that he had recently left town. Lou wasn't too worried about her friend, but Jade asked if she was sure. Did she want him to find the boy? Lou was happy and assured Jade that Walter knew how to survive in this world, so there was no need to worry about him. Lou looked out the window. After the whole incident with the demon hunter who was supposed to have killed Walter, the boy's fate had changed. As evening fell and the carriage headed for the manor, Lou thought to herself that she believed Walter's life would get better. The newspapers were full of reports about members of noble families dying from unknown causes. Lyon believed the Duke was responsible for these news reports and told Lydon about it. His brother was skeptical, as Cullen and the doctor were similar in some ways. They had a similar aura and acted alike. The brothers were waiting for a train at the station. Lydon was worried about whether Miss Lou had received their gift, to thank her for saving their lives. The twins were frustrated. They couldn't tell Lou that Percy's death was all Dr. Sybil's scheme. Lyon flashed back to the day he saw Percy and his friends hanging out in one of the academy's gardens. The guy was furious and wanted to take Percy out, but his thoughts were interrupted by Dr. Sybil's voice. He was right behind him. The doctor walked up to him, sharp as ever, and noticed he was staring only at Percy. Percy was having fun with the students, but Sybil already knew that student was responsible for the death of Lyon's sister. The doctor began to play Lyon like a puppet, whispering in his ear that he could help him take care of Percy. After their first meeting, the doctor's plan went smoothly, and Percy got what he deserved, but not without a hitch. The Duke's family got involved, and so did Leticia. After the plan was complete, the doctor was already waiting for the twins at his lab. When the brothers went to see the doctor, they had to spill everything, especially how the little girl had seen through their scheme. From their story, the doctor realized the Duke had a special affection for the child and had let the twins go, which he found amusing. Despite the imperfect plan, the doctor sent the twins to deliver a red flower to the Duke's manor. But when the brothers snuck into the manor, they decided to disobey the doctor's orders. The teens left a blue rose at the manor gate as a symbol of gratitude, apology, and, well, let's just say trouble. A train pulled into the station. Lyon reminded his brother that they messed up by not leaving the red flower, but they couldn't risk warning Lou that the doctor was after her. Lydon was angry that his brother had told Sybil about the little girl, so they needed to flee town before the Duke found out. Boarding was about to end, so the older brother told Lyon to hurry. Lyon froze. Lydon went back to drag his brother onto the train, but just then, they realized it was too late. Dr. Sybil appeared at the station, talking amicably with strangers, but he was clearly there for the twins. Lydon hid his face under his hat and dragged his brother away before anyone could spot them. But they had only taken a few steps before the doctor appeared behind them. Sybil grabbed Lyon's arm, making it impossible for the brothers to escape. Lyon tried to apologize for leaving without a word, but the man wouldn't let go of his arm. The doctor terrified them by bringing up Leticia, and Lyon stopped struggling. Sybil boasted that the girl had come to him when he opened his lab, so he was just waiting for her to grow up and truly show her abilities. The man tried to pull Lyon closer, but the guy resisted, as he needed to know if the girl was okay. The doctor sneered that he had grand plans for the girl, so he wouldn't harm her for now. The man finally overpowered Lyon's resistance and reminded him that he hadn't asked for anything in return for helping with Percy, just a small favor from the twins. The train's boarding was about to end, and only a few people were left at the station to see others off. The last passengers were scrambling to get into the carriages, but the doctor wasn't letting the two guys go. He was furious that they hadn't delivered the red flower to the Leveton manor. The newspaper fell from Lyon's hand as Sybil reminded him that everything he touched turned into a complete disaster. The man grabbed the guy's throat. Now that they had messed up the deal and the Duke had exposed them, there was no need to leave any loose ends. Lydon jumped in, pulling his brother aside and standing in front of the doctor. The situation amused the man. He already knew the two were heading north, but Lydon tried to lie that they were going west for work. Sybil held up the train tickets he had stolen from the guy's pocket, mocking his pathetic attempt to get away. The twins were terrified. Lyon frantically checked his jacket pocket, but the tickets in the doctor's hand were real. Suddenly, shouts about a fire echoed through the station. Passengers were desperately trying to escape the station as several carriages were engulfed in raging flames. Lydon demanded the doctor give them back their train tickets. The guy threw the tickets to the brothers, but instead of backing down, he activated his magic. The magic hit the brothers hard, making them dizzy, but they remembered the doctor's warning. He would take their lives in exchange for those tickets. Sybil decided not to linger at the station. Before leaving, he thanked the two guys for at least arranging the meeting with Leticia. Lyon collapsed to the ground while Lydon tried to resist the magic. Lydon watched the guy walk away, and as a parting gift, he promised them a painless death. The station was consumed by orange flames, but the twins lay motionless on the platform after the doctor's magic drained their mana. At breakfast, Jade read in the newspaper that the train station explosion was the hottest topic in the capital. According to the police report, the explosion mysteriously occurred in a freight car, which had no passengers. The fire was quickly extinguished, but the next morning, when the guards checked the station, another strange thing happened. A station supervisor on his morning patrol found a mysterious message that scared him to death. Near the clock tower, 2 bodies were found lying among the blue rose bushes. Jade finished the morning paper, but according to the article, the discovery of the bodies had truly terrified the local residents. Cullen listened to his son's account and, based on information from a friendly police officer, learned that the 2 teenagers at the station were Lion and Lydine. Jade turned the newspaper to other news. He felt sad that Lion, after avenging his sister, had never managed to find happiness. The Duke didn't understand how his son could think a murderer could ever attain happiness. The guy looked out the window, where Lou was playing with a ball in the yard, and admitted that despite everything he had done in the past, his life had become wonderful recently. Lou was in a great mood as she caught the ball, so seeing her like that filled Jade's heart with happiness. The Duke admitted he didn't always know what Jade was thinking, but Jade asked him not to interfere too much in his life. That tone sparked an argument between father and son, so Cheyenne tried to calm his master down, but he was already angry and ordered the butler to stand there quietly. Cullen ended the conversation, rolled up the newspaper, and ordered Cheyenne to get rid of the article so Leticia wouldn't find out anything about Lion and his brother. The Duke tried to calm down, telling himself that with so much happening in the capital, this incident would soon be forgotten. But Cheyenne sensed his anxiety. Cullen confessed that he'd had a feeling of being watched lately, but he just hadn't found the key evidence yet. The man gripped the arm of his chair anxiously, worried that the souls of those he had killed were coming back to haunt him because he had shown mercy to someone. The butler tried to convince the Duke he was just overreacting. Cullen watched Lou playing with a maid in the yard and, after some thought, ordered that the little girl must never be left alone and that her meetings with Maryanne could only take place at the manor. Weeks had passed since the station explosion, and winter had arrived, so all of Lou's recreation now took place within the manor under Cheyenne's supervision. Being stuck indoors was boring, so Lou tried to get permission to play outside, but Cheyenne didn't want to let her go for another walk in case she got sick. The little girl tried to guilt-trip the butler, promising to play outside for just a little while, only as long as the sun was still high in the sky. The man couldn't resist her cute look and agreed to let Lou out for a little while. Lou ran for the exit, forcing a maid to chase after her to put on her warm coat. The servants prepared my things for the walk, but Lou complained that she would be all bundled up and clumsy once she got outside. The little one decided to build a snowman while a few maids watched over her. The snowball Lou had worked so hard to roll suddenly bounced towards a fence. Lou chased after it, telling the maids not to worry. After picking up the snowball near the fence, Lou spotted some blue petals in the snow. On a stone tile sat a blue rose, perfectly neat, with its thorns clipped off. The girl examined the flower carefully. She couldn't figure out how it got there, as blue roses were long out of season. She thought of Lion and how he had picked a whole bouquet of blue roses that day on the island. The maids called for Lou to come back closer to the house, so the little one put the flower back where she found it. The blue rose remained by the fence as Lou ran back to the house. Lou spent all her time at the manor, studying with her tutor and doing her homework. Cheyenne peeked in to see what the little one was up to, but Lou was already finishing up a drawing of the manor for her teacher. The butler asked what she thought of the drawing, and Lou pointed out a few minor details about the colors. The man praised the girl's work and asked her to show the drawing of the manor to the Duke later. The little girl hid the drawing, complaining that Cullen drew so well that her drawing would only make him laugh. Lou noticed that Cheyenne often spoke the same way Cullen did, but the man simply praised her for her efforts. They had lit a fire in the living room fireplace, and Ray was happy to have company while she studied, but she felt awkward with the butler sitting with her when there was so much work to be done in the manor. Ray knew that Sheen was in charge of managing the entire manor, not Colin, so he shouldn't be the one checking her homework. The girl stopped drawing, worried that the Duke might punish the butler if he found out Sheen was keeping her company. She imagined how furious Colin and Jade would be if they found out she wasn't doing her homework on her own. But Sheen just chuckled, as the Leweltons would most likely be angry with him for getting to spend more time with the young lady. Ray understood what he meant, as her family was incredibly possessive of her. and very clingy. The little one complained that she had homework, but she couldn't write it because she had no talent for writing poetry. Ray thought to herself that writing poetry was part of a noble's life, but she didn't want to do it for the rest of her life. Sheen smiled and said that he had also gone through a phase of learning poetry and couplets when he was a child. The butler advised Ray to relax and, if she didn't understand things like tones yet, to use simple things or sound from everyday life instead. The little one thought about everyday things, but all that came to mind were various desserts. The man encouraged her, saying that writing a poem about chocolate cake would be great practice. Sheen said that after leaving the orphanage, he took training courses at the temple. The girl was surprised that the man knew ancient literature and praised him for working very hard. There was a book next to the girl, and Sheen asked if she needed any help with her homework. The little one glanced at the book, wondering if the butler knew any fairy tales. But since Sheen was trained by priests, they weren't very interested in simple things, especially fairy tales. Ray noticed that whenever the butler remembered his old life at the temple, he would become dejected. The man offered to help her read the book, but Ray was prepared to handle it herself. The girl suggested that if he didn't know any children's stories, he could listen to her read. The offer caught him off guard. He didn't know how to react, which scared the little one a bit. The man began to think about what would happen if the masters found out he was helping Ray, but he felt he could handle the punishment. Sheen picked up the book, which was a very popular story in the Empire about its most evil and most righteous mages. He looked at the book's description and realized the story would be about a magical kingdom. He pointed to a picture and asked Ray if the character in it was a dark mage. The little one insisted that a dark mage couldn't possibly come from a ducal family, but Sheen reminded her that Colin was no angel either. The man opened the book and told Ray that the light mages in it symbolized the beginning of a new life. Ray began to read the book aloud, and Sheen became engrossed in the story of dark and light mages living in the same empire. The light mages were sorcerers who used the power of magic stones to become the strongest wizards. However, there were also dark mages who used their magic to harm ordinary people. Over time, the people of the Empire rose up against the evil mages and decided to get rid of them. But among the evil mages, there were some who tried to hold on to their light side. One of the leaders of these mages was a dark mage named Leveton. Eventually, the mage Leveton began to fight for the freedom of all wrongly accused mages. However, the light sorcerers also had a leader who opposed Leveton, and so the battle between the mages came to be known as the War of Vengeance. Although it was a massive battle, the Empire won, and Leveton defeated the light sorcerer and his associates. After that brutal war, they were executed. The royal family forbade mages from showing their powers to ordinary people. This was how the magical families were formed, known only to the king who was close to them. Ray closed the last chapter of the book, which said that all the bad mages got what they deserved. The butler applauded the little one, saying she read very well and that her skills were much better now. Sheen thanked Ray, saying that although the story was famous throughout the Empire, he still enjoyed hearing something new. Ray still wasn't used to receiving so many compliments, but it was part of life at the manor now, so she was getting used to it. Then Ray raised an eyebrow at the book and asked Sheen if he thought the story was a bit strange. After a moment of thought, both the man and Ray realized the story did sound quite cruel. Ray looked at the pictures in the book and felt the author could have drawn it to be cuter. Looking at a portrait of the Duke, Sheen admitted that the Duke was the first mage to side with humans, so some of the fairy tale was true. Since the Duke was basically a member of the royal family in name only, he had immense influence throughout the Empire. Colin's cooperation with the king wasn't just about him using magic to vitalize the Empire. He also obtained a license to print money through his own businesses. Sheen got up from the sofa. He had been with Ray for a long time, and now he needed to get back to work and prepare dinner. The man promised there would be chocolate cake for dessert, which made the little one's day. Ray returned to her homework, deciding to take Sheen's advice and give poetry another try. The little one picked up her pencil and started scribbling down her thoughts, a little nervous but super excited. However, after a few words, her inspiration ran dry, so she wasn't that thrilled. Ray stayed in the living room, thinking that her talent would eventually blossom and she would figure out the poem. But as she was writing her poem, she fell asleep and didn't wake up until the Duke carried her to her bedroom. The man shook his head in annoyance. He didn't like that, even after living in the manor for so long, his little daughter's weight was still not up to the standard for her age. Colin gently put Ray down, promising to measure her height to see if she was growing, though he secretly wished she would stay this small forever. He made no secret of his hope that Ray would stay with him forever and never leave the family manor. Colin left Ray on the bed, telling her to come down for dinner, and then he left the bedroom. He had intended to return to his study, but he turned and walked further down the hall. Passing the railing, the Duke glanced curiously toward the living room. The butler was reading a letter when Colin called out to him. The Duke descended the stairs into the living room, and his arrival made Sheen nervously hide the paper. Colin didn't believe the butler was fine, so he didn't rush to another room. He noticed the servant's suspicious behavior and demanded he bring out the paper. Sheen trembled with nervousness, claiming he was just trying to return Ray's homework, but Colin knew he had already checked on how she was doing. Just as Sheen began to explain that he had found the note on a pillow, Jade entered the living room, but the Duke was already trying to snatch the homework from his hands. Colin grabbed the paper, and he and Jade began to examine its contents. On the paper was an illustrated poem, and the first line said that Ray loved the sound of her dad coming home to the sound of carriage wheels. Ray also loved the sound of Jade knocking on her door to play and the clinking of clean plates, because Sheen would soon serve a delicious dinner. But the best thing in the whole manor was the chocolate cake that made Ray happy. After reading the poem, the Leveton father and son were horrified by the crooked handwriting and the unforgivable mistakes their little daughter had made in her homework. Colin decided to take action, and he came up with the idea of inviting more scholars so they could better bring out his daughter's genius. Jade was analyzing the poem, worried that Ray might have gotten lazy on the last part of her homework and not put in the proper effort. But despite all the flaws, the family decided they had to preserve the girl's work and frame it. But Sheen tried to dissuade them from telling the little one that they had seen her work. The Levitons reread the poem, and now it seemed to them like the best piece of literature ever created by a master. Sheen watched the two, but deep down, he anxiously wondered what consequences their undisguised admiration would bring. Jade waved the paper, begging his father to preserve it with magic, like the most precious creation in their family. Colin immediately turned to the butler and, in a threatening tone, reminded him that it was extremely inappropriate to read someone else's poem, but no excuse would help Sheen. However, the Duke was more angry about Sheen being mentioned in the poem than he was about him reading it. Jade suddenly shouted that he didn't like that the first line of the poem mentioned his father and not him, because as the older brother, he played with Leticia more. Colin boasted that he was the breadwinner of their family, so he deserved the glorious spot. But Sheen reminded him that they had better return the paper to the girl, or she would throw a fit. The Duke was already imagining sending copies of the poem to all their relatives and publishing it in the newspaper, but Sheen assured him that Leticia would be angry with him for the rest of her life after such a plan. Sheen bowed, and Colin shot him a death glare, but reminded him that Ray wasn't ready to have her work judged by others. Jade agreed that such a creation should stay within the walls of their manor, so he would go to Ray's room himself to praise her for her efforts. But Sheen began to tell the family that they couldn't praise her too much, or they would kill her talent before it had a chance to blossom. The butler was relieved after convincing his masters, but decided to keep the drawing diary a secret, where Colin would plaster all over the newspapers. A few days later, the truth about the poem reading came out, and the little one threw a tantrum at the dinner table. Colin wondered what was wrong, but Ray retorted that she didn't love her dad and brother anymore. A dead silence fell over the dining room, which began to panic the Leveton father and son. The Duke fidgeted, trying to tell the child she didn't mean it, but he knew he couldn't bluff his way out of it, so he threw Sheen under the bus, saying he was the first one to read the poem. This made Ray even angrier, and she called her dad a liar, saying Sheen would never do that to her, and the butler's heart sank. Jade decided to defend the girl's love and shifted all the blame back to his father, though it didn't exactly smooth things over. Ray didn't touch her food, turned in her chair, and decided to leave the dining room for some fresh air. The men all watched her as she walked away, but the young lady didn't even look back. Back in her own room, Ray tried to vent all her anger by having a big fight with her blanket. She screamed for a long time and beat up the blanket, but it only made her angrier instead of calmer. What really made Ray angry was that she felt so ashamed that someone had found her poem. It turned out the Leveton father and son were terrible at playing it cool. Jade had mentioned Ray reciting her poem during their first dinner together, and then before dinner was over, Colin promised that chocolate cake would become a staple in their house, so Ray suspected they had seen her homework. Ray had poured a lot of her heart into that poem, but Sheen's advice had helped her finish it. So when she found out the truth like this, she was ready to teach a lesson to anyone who crossed her. After a while in her room, she calmed down. Since there would be chocolate cake every day, she decided to wait until after dinner to feast on alone. A knock came from the bedroom door, and Colin's voice came from the hallway. Leticia threw off the covers and smoothed them out a bit on the bed. Then she quietly crept to the door to listen to what was happening in the hallway. She almost grabbed the doorknob, but stopped timidly. Ray proudly pulled her hand back from the door. Then she crossed her arms. Colin, on the other side of the door, heard the faint footsteps stop, so he decided to be clever and told Ray he had some important information for her. The girl heard the muffled voice and was curious, but a feeling of embarrassment kept her from approaching the door. Colin knocked again and whispered that his offer was something Ray would really like. The little one grabbed the doorknob, and she began to imagine that they might go to the circus or a cafe. The Duke waited a moment, but when the door didn't open, he called out that he was ready to take the little one to school. Ray threw the door open and yelled at the man not to go anywhere and to wait for her. Colin was leaning against the wall, so he was relieved when the girl finally came out of her room. The girl pretended that after talking to the doctor, she was willing to hear his offer about a private school. The man promised he had a way to get Ray enrolled in the middle of the school year, so it would be good for Ray to develop her writing skills among other students. Ray knew that school was expensive, but it would be wrong to refuse such an opportunity. Colin felt his offer wasn't impressing Ray, so he was about to leave, but the little one grabbed his shirt. The man said she could join the class for 2 months now and then decide if she wanted to continue her studies in science. The little one let go of his shirt and, holding back her emotions, agreed to go to school, but she had one condition. Her father had to apologize for reading her poem without permission. Colin grimaced. He had never apologized to anyone in his life. The words stunned the girl, as now he might change his mind because Ray had been acting too freely since being accepted by the family. The Duke took Ray in his arms and promised to learn how to apologize so he could make his daughter the happiest girl ever. Ray was touched when the man apologized for going too far. The girl narrowed her eyes to make sure he was truly sorry and not just because he got caught messing up. Colin showered Ray with praise, promising to treat her like a true gentleman. As her father, he cared about everything she did, but from now on he would respect her boundaries. But he was worried if Ray still loved him after he had messed up, so the little girl had to reassure him. The Duke relaxed, relieved that his little daughter was no longer angry with him. Night fell on the manor, but Ray kept pestering the Duke with questions about who would be going to school with her. The next morning, the manor was a hive of activity, with maids scrambling to find the perfect outfit for the girl's first day of school. Maryanne came to help with the preparations, but she didn't like the outfits the servants had picked out. The last dress made the child look like a priest. Colin and Jade waited in the room, and the man could hear frustrated shouts from the dressing room, but he encouraged Maryanne to find the best outfit for such an important event. Finally finished with the exhausting preparations, Maryanne shrieked with delight. They had dressed the little one in a light green dress that looked adorable with her pink hair. The maid wanted to braid a ribbon into her hair, but the madam ordered a fluffy hairstyle so the other students wouldn't think Ray was a little kid. The girl checked the jewelry box and decided she should try on a hairpin. Maryanne picked out a hairpin that matched the dress and clipped it into Ray's hair. Colin was already losing his patience, eager to show the other high society children how beautiful his daughter was. His sister kept Colin in check, as he needed to make the right impression on the first day of school, or problems could arise later. The Duke had just finished his newspaper when Ray asked for permission to wear Maryanne's outfit, as the madam always had excellent taste in all things. Maryanne covered Ray's cheeks with kisses, as the girl always knew how to give the best compliments. The woman sat Ray down in front of a mirror and advised her to make friends on her first day. As the woman combed her hair, Ray thought about how Walter was the only friend she'd ever had, so she was still worried about him. Maryanne decorated her hair with a hairpin, but reminded the little one that the school she was going to was for nobles, so it might not be like a regular school. The Duke exclaimed that it was Madame Pauline's prestigious school, which surprised his sister. She pressed her brother about what on earth he did to get her a spot in that class through the back door. Maryanne had been anxious before knowing which school they were talking about, but now she felt much calmer. The little one peeked out from behind the mirror. Her family's behavior indicated that the school was quite famous. The servants picked out a coat for the girl that matched her green dress, making her look even more stunning. Colin took Ray's hand and led her toward the exit. They needed to get on the road so as not to be late for class. Ray waved goodbye to Jade and promised she would be home soon. The family carriage left the manor and headed down the snowy road toward the school. Ray had many questions about the school, especially about making friends, but Maryanne remembered there were only a few dozen students there. The child began to stomp her feet nervously as the madam explained that the school's education was very strict and depended on your noble family status. The school was full of nobles, so Ray was worried about whether she would fit in. Maryanne was surprised her brother didn't catch their daughter's hint and reminded him there were always other, possibly more suitable schools. Colin stated flatly that only the most prestigious place was worthy of his talented daughter. Ray wasn't listening at all. She had never been to school before, so she was worried about keeping up with everything, but the madam promised they tailored the teaching to each student. When Ray wondered more about those methods, Maryanne hesitated. The carriage stopped in the school's courtyard, so Maryanne only had time to admit that all the students were from royal families, or people who were close to them. Madame Pauline had been waiting for the new students since morning, so she greeted the ducal family personally. Colin unabashedly declared that his daughter was the best student for this place. Then he threatened that he really hoped she would be treated properly. This attitude made the madam want to laugh a little, as the rumors about the Duke's change in behavior were completely true. The woman saw through Colin's plan, but he told her to quietly keep an eye on his daughter. The madam glanced at the young lady, but she was standing next to Colin, motionless and adjusting to her surroundings. The little one curtsied and introduced herself as Leticia. Ray's politeness impressed the madam, who promised to assign the girl a teacher for the day while she could make some new friends. The little girl was excited by the news of having a teacher. Then the madam suggested they go to the classroom to meet the other students. Madame Pauline bowed to Maryanne, saying it was an honor to meet the saintess of their temple. As etiquette required, Maryanne returned the bow, as Madame Pauline was from a noble family she hadn't seen in a long time. The madam walked past the Levetons, and her voice became stern, assuring the Duke she would find a way to take care of the young lady. Ray was captivated by the lady's noble demeanor. She exuded the air of a noble woman. But then Maryanne whispered something that made Ray's jaw drop. Madame Pauline was actually a man. What a shock. The madam turned to Leticia and invited her to go to class with him. The family said goodbye to the little one, and as Ray waved, the Duke promised to pick her up that evening. The Levetons were in no hurry to leave, watching as the madam led Ray down another corridor. The school's hallways were empty. The madam briefed her that Ray's classmates were all her age, so if she got along with them, she could study with them until graduation. The news of having classmates her age cheered Ray up, and she was less scared by the time they reached the classroom door. The madam entered the classroom, dispelling any lingering doubts that the students might be different from her old friends, and Ray followed close behind. The woman introduced Ray to the students, but the girl also decided to show her manners, curtsying and reminding them that she was also the daughter of Duke Colin Leveton. A group of children surrounded the girl, not rushing to introduce themselves, so Madame Pauline suggested they have tea together during the break. The classroom door slammed shut behind the madam, but the silence in the room continued. One of the students, her face full of doubt, asked if Ray was really the Duke's daughter. The student introduced herself as Levin, her blonde hair in magnificent curls and wearing a rare dark blue dress. Levin walked right up to the girl, but Ray maintained her pleasant mood and introduced herself as well. Levin was aggressive, firing off a barrage of questions that demanded quick answers. She told Ray that she was now in a class with the most elite children under the age of 14. Levin held her head high with pride, declaring that most of their class belonged to the royal family. But with Ray's knack for numbers, she calculated that only 2 of them were actual royalty. The student kept questioning Leticia, sneeringly asking her why on earth she was at this school. Leticia could see that Levine wasn't a real threat, so she remained gentle and simply suggested she ask the adults how she got into the school. This tone annoyed Levine, as she was used to people obeying her every word, not being told to find things out for herself. The girl huffed and turned away, sarcastically assuring her that since the Duke himself had brought Leticia, they would take pity on her and wouldn't kick her out, even though their skills were much better. But before Leticia could answer, Levine pointed at her and, in a sharp voice, told her to follow their rules. The student was convinced that noble blood was the key to the world's future, so Leticia needed to know her place. Leticia no longer saw any difference between street kids and kids from private schools, so she agreed with Levine's statement about the future of noble families. Pleased with her small victory, Levine decided to enlighten Leticia on how to deal with their little circle. The girl announced they would be putting on a play at the royal palace during the annual celebration, but Leticia's lack of reaction annoyed Levine. She started screaming hysterically, saying that only those who played the main role in the play could succeed in society. Levine shouted that her mother was convinced of the play's importance, but Leticia had long known that kind of motherly advice wasn't for her. The girl kept boasting about her noble lineage, so she decided she couldn't give Leticia a role in the upcoming play because she wasn't even from a prestigious family. Leticia guessed that Levine was afraid of losing the main role, but she still wasn't interested in the play, so she promised not to audition for a part. This refusal surprised the students, who worried about what Leticia would do while everyone else was rehearsing. The girl picked up the script from the floor. She had read a vast number of books in her past life, so she could put that experience to good use. Smiling sweetly, Leticia offered to help edit the script. The offer startled Levine, who had no idea what a script editor even did. The other students started whispering until the boldest one wanted to ask what an editor's job was. Levine covered her friend's mouth with her hand so they wouldn't look like complete fools. But Leticia had already read a few lines of the script and immediately suggested changes. The girl pointed out complicated phrases in the text and suggested replacing them with simpler words to make them easier to memorize. The children gathered around Leticia, and she noticed the play was similar to a book she had read before, so she easily suggested alternative lines to the students. After understanding the suggestion, one student was shocked that the newcomer could interpret the text on her first day. Levine's friend again asked for the meaning of a word, and Levine jumped in front of her and began to explain in a more threatening tone, saying that Leticia was simply reimagining a classic story in a modern way. Leticia boasted that she had a certificate from a doctor who discovered her talent for linguistic sciences, so ordinary acting didn't appeal to her. She was perfectly capable of controlling the entire preparation process for the play. The students started whispering again, saying that Leticia had decided to become more important than the actors and take on the role of a drama consultant, and this whispered gossip only made Levine angrier. Levine called a meeting, and the girls moved to the side, whispering in a circle. The girl began to incite the students against Leticia because she was just a commoner who dared to encroach on the duties of nobles. The girls started arguing that they couldn't do anything about Leticia because she was very sweet and could win many hearts. The argument grew more heated, and Levine convinced the others that the ducal family's status couldn't hide Leticia's humble origins, and she had to be driven out. Although the students tried to discuss everything quietly, Leticia could clearly hear all their plans concerning her. Levine was angry because her friends were now trying to make excuses since they had all initially opposed Leticia to avoid losing their noble status. Suddenly, a girl said that Leticia was connected to the Duke abandoning Lady Rose, so she was dangerous. However, when this secret information was no longer a secret, the student was afraid she had said too much. Leticia didn't hear the full sentence, but now she was walking with determined steps toward her classmates, so they would tell her everything they had discussed. Levine tried to protect the girls, her voice trembling, but then she blurted out that she knew the whole shameful truth about Leticia's actions. Apparently, at some lavish party, Levine had overheard a rumor that Leticia was manipulating the Duke behind the scenes, using him to disrespect noble ladies. Leticia started to think about Lady Rose, who, long ago, had tried to sell her to some traveling circus. So, after all that, Lady Rose hadn't turned over a new leaf. She was still spreading scandalous gossip about the ducal family among the children of the rich. Leticia couldn't change her classmates' opinion of her. The power of rumors was too strong, so she just walked to the window and let the girls have their meeting. The child looked at the snow-covered courtyard, realizing she wouldn't be making any high society friends today, even though Colin had sworn she would love it here. Leticia wanted to focus on her schoolwork, but after hearing about the upcoming tea party, all she could think about was what kind of desserts would be there. Levine cleared her throat dramatically, getting everyone's attention, and announced they had a solution. The girl decided to be blunt. It was beneath high society children like them to mix with a commoner like Leticia, and the Leveton family status couldn't change that. Stung by these words, Leticia clenched her fists, trying to stay calm, as she had long known she could never replace the Duke's real daughter. Levine smiled smugly and said that Leticia could only join their circle if she did everything they asked. Levine's friend mentioned a pet parade in the conservatory at Central Park on Saturday. The girl leaned conspiratorially toward Leticia, wanting to know if she had a pet. Levine mocked Leticia for not having a pet, and even as everyone burst out laughing, she still said that even if she had one, they would never invite her. The girls started listing all the activities they had planned for the week, so unless Leticia joined their circle, she would miss all the parties and events. But Levine jumped in front of Leticia and offered her a deal: obey them for a month, and then she might have a chance to hang out with the cool kids. The girl tried to convince Leticia that her offer was the best option for a poor little orphan like her. Then Levine listed a whole bunch of rules. First, Leticia had to be the first to arrive in the classroom and the last to leave. She had to write extremely sincere letters to Levine's closest friends and give them gifts. But most importantly, Leticia could not refuse any request the girls made of her. These rules really annoyed Leticia, but Levine was thrilled, thinking she had come up with the perfect way for the commoner girl to make new friends. The little girl's face turned red with anger, and she realized these girls were no better than her, especially since they spent hardly any time studying. Leticia tried to stay calm and asked to confirm if she understood the deal. When Levine saw that Leticia was interested, she continued to sweetly emphasize the importance of the decision. Leticia decided to stand her ground and declare that playing with her brother at home was far better than anything the girls were offering, so she was out. Levine couldn't believe her ears, but the whispering behind her started up again. Leticia walked right past Levine, saying she wouldn't let anyone turn her into a servant, and even for a friend, she wouldn't agree to such trashy conditions. Levine was furious, her fists clenched and trembling. The girl's face turned beet red, and now she was convinced this commoner had no manners and that Leticia didn't deserve the chance of a deal. Leticia walked to her desk without looking back, even as Levine had a complete meltdown behind her, held back by a few friends. The little girl put her backpack on the desk. She tried to calm down, but now she was sure that getting along with nobles really wasn't for her. As he had promised, the Duke appeared at the school right after classes ended. The man picked up the little girl, but as they walked into the courtyard, Leticia glanced back at the school building. She spotted several classmates in one of the windows, watching her leave. Leticia found the behavior of these nobles amusing. The carriage headed toward the Leveton estate, and on the way, Colin eagerly asked the girl how her first day went. It was important for him to know who Leticia had made friends with, but she just vaguely said she had spent the time getting to know the school. When Leticia mentioned they had a tea party, Colin sensed something was wrong. When he tried to find out if she liked the school, Leticia didn't tell her father the truth. But her trembling hands didn't escape Colin's notice, and he saw the little girl looked like she could cry at any moment. Leticia shook her head. She didn't want to admit that she had become a disgrace to the Leveton family's name on her first day because of their different social statuses. She wasn't going to betray her father's trust, so she repeated that everything was fine. The girl turned to the window, but he didn't like that and tried to get her to turn back. Although Colin tried to remain calm, a dark aura began to gather around him. He tapped Leticia on the shoulder, hinting that she should tell the truth. After a moment's thought, the little girl admitted that her classmates had told her she couldn't go to the pet party on Saturday. The Duke was about to fly into a rage, but Leticia reacted quickly, adding that she couldn't go simply because she didn't have a pet. The man didn't understand, but Leticia tried to explain that she wasn't ready to get an animal just to attend a tea party. The little girl assured him she would rather spend the weekend with her family than with a bunch of kids she didn't know. But then she worried that Colin might be busy on Saturday and wouldn't be around. The man suggested Leticia could do both over the weekend, as the day was long, and she could come home to her family after the tea party. Colin wrapped a warm scarf around the little girl's neck and told her to cheer up, saying he had a pet she would definitely love. But Leticia had never seen an animal at home. though it did explain why Cheyenne always told her not to play in the woods where there might be small animals. The Duke assured the little girl that she would take his pet to the tea party, because as a member of the ducal family, she could go anywhere uninvited. Colin was flattered that his status was so respected that sometimes people even cried with joy upon seeing him. So Leticia absolutely had to go to the event and give others a chance to see the young lady of the ducal house. Just in case, Leticia asked if the animal was a giant spider, but Colin promised the pet was super cute and everyone would love it. The little girl calmed down, deciding to trust her father, as he surely wouldn't have tamed some wild beast. A few days passed, and Saturday arrived. A carriage stopped in front of the estate, ready to take Leticia to the conservatory for the tea party. The little girl walked down the hall and screamed in terror when she finally saw Colin's pet. The man introduced the animal, named Fifi, and advised Leticia to pet it often to keep Fifi calm. Cheyenne offered to get a different pet from the woods if Leticia didn't like Fifi. The butler joked that you can't just marry someone who lives in the water, but you could always go to the zoo and get the elephant the Duke had brought from overseas. Leticia wasn't interested in taking an elephant to tea, so she refused. Cheyenne assured her that Fifi didn't bite and that the young lady would be perfectly safe. The man urged Leticia toward the exit, or she would be late for the event. Jade came down the stairs, dressed in a sharp black suit. Leticia was impressed by her brother's outfit, but she had no idea where he was going. Everyone was acting mysteriously. Of course, Leticia was upset that her classmates were ignoring her, but she hadn't wanted to be their best friend either. Jade pulled Leticia onto the carriage. He had decided to tag along to help her deal with the other students. The guy smiled smugly, promising that these things were much easier to handle with an older brother around. The carriage stopped in front of a glass conservatory, and the sound of people chatting could already be heard. The girls had brought their furry friends, which sat on cushions while their owners chatted about boring noble trifles. Suddenly, a threatening roar echoed through the conservatory, sending the small pets scattering and the classmates scrambling in terror. The girls stopped drinking their tea and stared anxiously at the main entrance of the conservatory. But as the source of the wild roar grew closer, their faces grew paler. Leticia walked along the garden path, carefully leading a huge tiger on a golden chain. But then the tiger lunged toward the tables, and Leticia couldn't hold it back, the chain slipping from her hands. The girls jumped up, scrambling to find cover. The classmates huddled in a corner, and Levine tried to hide behind the other girls, but they were pressed so tightly against the wall that they couldn't move. Leticia managed to grab the chain and, after making the tiger sit beside her, introduced the animal as her father's pet, Fifi. Levine was about to faint from fear, as the tiger was standing right in front of her. But the moment the girl mentioned the Duke, the tiger roared again and leaned in close, scaring her half to death. Levine fell to her knees, begging Leticia not to let the beast eat her. Jade walked in, smiling smugly and saying that Princess Levine's pet meet and greet was the most boring ever, so he had no interest in staying. Jade's appearance distracted Levine from the tiger, and she focused all her attention on him. But just then, Leticia was completely stunned, because it turned out that the person she had been antagonizing all week was a real princess. Back at school, Leticia was super embarrassed about what had happened and just wanted to disappear into thin air. Jade approached the princess and, with feigned sincerity, thanked her for her kindness to his sister. The princess started lying, saying they hadn't managed to become friends with Leticia because Jade's sister didn't want to. Jade knew all the royal gossip, so he advised the princess to be careful and smart if she wanted to stay in the royal family, especially since she was so far down the line of succession. The guy leaned in close to the princess and assured her that, unlike her, the Duke had only one daughter, so if their families started a feud, the king wouldn't value one of many princesses. Jade smiled smugly, suggesting that Levine should tone it down and behave herself from now on. My brother turned to Leticia and told her to say hello to her new friends. Jade found the whole thing hilarious, joking that the friends were so happy to see Leticia that they were crying tears of joy. Leticia wasn't happy, though. She knew Jade was part of the ducal family, but she didn't expect him to be so good at playing these high society kids. The realization that she was also part of the ducal family made her heart race, feeling the gravity of the situation. The little girl hugged Fifi and thanked Levine for her kindness, even though Leticia hadn't known about her princess status. Then Leticia smiled sweetly and suggested they cultivate their friendship in the future. Levine couldn't believe a commoner was offering to be friends with a princess. Fifi started to growl softly. Leticia stroked the pet's fur, concluding that these girls wouldn't change, so she agreed with her brother that this tea party was incredibly boring. The little girl turned, picked up Fifi, and headed for the exit, as she still wanted to spend time with her family today. After a moment, Leticia glanced back at Lavin and suggested that they could at least try to smile at each other when they met in the future. This short remark really annoyed the princess, but she remained in the corner of the conservatory while the other girls tried to distract her. Leticia noticed that after talking to her brother, the princess wasn't so quick to speak ill. The family headed for the exit with Fifi, but now Leticia truly understood what it was like to be the Duke's daughter, the intimidating taste of it. The carriage once again headed for the Leveton estate. Fifi lay sprawled on the carriage floor, taking up almost all the space, but Leticia found the tiger incredibly cute. Suddenly, the tiger twisted around and nipped the hem of her coat with its teeth. Leticia was still scared of the tiger's sharp fangs, so she got a little frightened whenever it opened its mouth. Jade told Leticia to scratch Fifi's belly. Apparently, when the tiger wanted to be affectionate, it would use its teeth to get attention. Leticia was curious how her father had tamed such a pet, and Jade explained that dark magic users possessed incredible hypnotic abilities. A year ago, Colin had rescued the poor little thing from poachers, and Fifi appeared at the ducal house. So once the tiger recovered, it got a bit attached to Colin and started acting as if he were its master. Leticia stroked the tiger's fur, concluding that it was definitely not dangerous. The animal's fur was super soft and shimmered in the sun, and for a moment, Leticia even wanted to smell it. But Jade was completely bewildered by this, which raised a string of questions in his mind. Leticia started hugging the animal, and her actions convinced her brother of how fearless she was. The little girl giggled, but if her family said the tiger wasn't dangerous, then she shouldn't worry. Leticia admitted she was scared of what would happen in the future, because Levine was a princess and she was nothing. The consequences could be severe, but Leticia had already thought about it. She might have to drop out of school. Now her classmates were afraid of the Duke and wouldn't bother her anymore, so they would avoid her in every class. Jade boasted that he would make everyone leave the school if necessary, or Leticia could just pick another place. But the guy also threatened that if she continued to hide the bullying at school from him, he would be forced to, let's just say, he would be very disappointed. The little girl looked at her brother in surprise, but he was second in command of the family, so he could take action. Leticia tried to calm down and just thanked him for taking the time for her today. Since joining this family, Leticia had changed. She used to think that even if she tried to be nice, offering care and gifts, it wouldn't change the bad behavior of those kids, that it wouldn't solve anything, because no amount of gifts could change the fact that they were from different classes. So now, with so many people in the ducal family caring for her, she could no longer cowardly endure any form of criticism. Leticia looked at the approaching estate. She was no longer someone who could be easily cast aside. The winter scenery outside the window no longer seemed so cold to her. The moment had arrived. She looked at Jade and realized she finally had people who cherished her and gave her a chance to change, and that was what gave her the strength of confidence. In any case, the carriage was almost at the estate. There were many challenges ahead for Leticia, but now that she had the support she desperately needed, they no longer seemed so daunting.